It is said that archers were the kings of the medieval battlefield. From afar, they commanded the battlefield, raining arrows on the enemy while avoiding sword fights and horse stampedes. With a bow in hand, you could cut down an armored knight before he reached your ranks, your arrows piercing holes in his armor like whispers of death. You could stand there proudly, knowing that your skill could change the course of the battle. Eyes sharp, fingers steady, mind calculating the wind, the bow, the perfect moment to shoot. Sounds glorious, right? A safer path to glory than the chaos of close combat. A chance to be respected for your accuracy and power, without risking a sword to your throat. But the truth behind a bowstring is much more serious than the arrows it fires. The life of a medieval archer was not a romantic dance on the battlefield, nor a safe haven from the horrors of war. It was a life of suffering, relentless training, harsh conditions, and brutal realities that broke the body and haunted the mind. Before you envy them, do you want to know the naked truth behind that glamour? If you like this video, don't forget to like and subscribe so we have more motivation to produce more quality products. And now, let's find out 6 reasons why you wouldn't want to be a medieval archer. Chapter 1. The path begins. Training from childhood. You open your eyes before dawn, before the roosters call, before the village stirs with the creak of cartwheels and the cough of chimney smoke. The straw beneath you is itchy, but you are used to it. The sweet smell of hay mingling with the earthiness of the dirt floor, a reminder that your world is simple and small. You are 7, maybe 8, and today is like yesterday and the day before and the day before that, because today you will practice with your bow again. In medieval England, it was not a choice for boys like you. It was the law. The assize of arms, the statute of Winchester, and countless local ordinances required that every boy over a certain age practice archery on Sundays, on holy days, on days when you would rather be resting, or helping your mother in the kitchen garden, or sneaking away to the woods to watch the deer flick their white tails in the dawn. The parish constables and village elders would walk the fields to ensure you were there, your small body braced against the wind, your hands gripping the bow that was still too large for your thin arms, and your eyes squinting into the rising sun as you tried again and again and again. They said it was for your own good, that every English boy needed to be ready to defend the realm. Wars were not distant rumors. They were a constant drumbeat beneath your feet, as lords fought lords, as kings planned campaigns, as whispers of France and Scotland and Wales filtered to the smoky air of the village alehouse. You would be needed, they said, to stand with your bow when the time came, to rain arrows upon the enemies of the crown, to serve as the backbone of England's might. You did not think of glory as you practiced. Your bow was made of ash or elm. It would pale and rough against your fingers, and each draw of the string made your shoulders ache. The bow was not yet the mighty longbow of war, but it was heavy enough to make your arms tremble, to leave red marks on your fingers where the string snapped back as you fumbled your release. Your father would stand behind you, his rough hands guiding your elbows, correcting your stance, urging you to focus. His voice was stern, but there was worry in his eyes, a flicker of understanding, because he knew what was to stand in the mud of battlefield, to feel the breath of fear and hope mixing as the sky darkened with arrows. In the village fields, straw targets were set up, circles drawn crudely with charcoal. The centers darkened with pitch to give you something to aim at. You and the other boys would line up, the older ones already strong, their arrows flying true, while you struggled to pull the string back to your ear, your arms quivering as the arrow wobbled and fell short. They would laugh, sometimes, but more often they would simply nod, because they had been you once, and they knew that every inch gained in draw length was a victory. The wind was a constant companion, pulling at your hair, chilling the sweat on your neck, carrying the scent of animals and damp earth. It taught you to read its touch on your skin, to feel the way it would push an arrow off course, to adjust your aim before you even loose a string. The practice fields were your classroom, the bow your teacher, the string song a reminder that precision was born of patience, of repetition, of the willingness to fail and try again day after day. Some days your fingers would bleed, the blisters tearing open as you tried to grip the string. The pain a sharp, hot reminder of how far you had to go. Your mother would shake her head as she washed your hands, the water pink with your blood, but she would not stop you, because she knew the law, and she knew that a son who could shoot well might one day return home from war alive. You learned to fletch your own arrows, to bind feathers to shafts with careful hands, to sharpen the points against stone, to understand the balance of weight and length that made the arrow fly true. It was a craft as much as a skill, a daily ritual that tied you to the rhythms of your village, to the heartbeat of a nation that saw archery as its lifeline. Even when your body cried for rest, when your arms ached so deeply that you could barely lift them to your shoulders, you would return to practice fields. Because absence could mean a fine for your family, or the shame of being called lazy, unpatriotic, unworthy. The church bells would ring for Mass, and then you would return to your bow. Because the Sabbath was not a day of rest for boys like you. It was another day to prepare for the battles that might one day call your name. You grew stronger. Your shoulders broadened. Your fingers hardened. Your back learned the rhythm of drawing and releasing, until it became as natural as breathing. You learned to love the quiet moment before you let the string go, the breath you held, the stillness in the world as the arrow flew, the soft thud as it struck the target, or the sigh of disappointment when it fell short. Each arrow was a lesson. Each miss a teacher. Each hit a promise that you were improving, that you were becoming the archer you were expected to be. But beneath it all, even as you learned to take pride in the tightening of your groups on the target, in the way your arms no longer trembled as they once did, there was a truth that whispered to you in the wind. You were being prepared for war. The bow was not a toy, not a sport, not a pastime to while away the hours of youth. It was a weapon, and you were learning to use it not to feed your family with rabbits from the hedgerows, but to kill other men, to stand on fields of mud and blood, to send arrows into bodies and watch them fall. There were moments, as you lay in your straw bed at night, your muscles burning, your hands wrapped in cloth to protect the torn skin, when you would stare into the darkness and wonder what it would be like to face the enemy, to pull your bow and let your arrow fly, to see it find its mark in flesh instead of straw. You did not know then how heavy that knowledge would become, how the pride of accuracy would mix with the weight of what it meant to kill. For now, you were just a boy, forced by law to practice, to become strong enough to pull a bow that was taller than you, to learn to aim in wind and rain, to stand in the cold fields while your breath fogged the air, to learn the patience and discipline that would one day be demanded of you in a place far from your village fields. This was the path of the medieval archer, the long, hard road that began in childhood, paved with laws and expectations, with sweat and pain, with dreams of glory that often hid the truth of what lay ahead. It was a path you could not choose to avoid, a destiny shaped by the needs of kings and wars, a calling that sounded like duty, but felt at times like a burden heavier than any bow you would ever carry. They called it the longbow, but it could have just as well been called the burden. It stood taller than many boys, a slender curve of wood that seemed harmless at rest, but revealed its true nature the moment you tried to pull it back. Made from yew or sometimes elm or ash, a single stave of wood with a string of hemp or flax. To draw a war bow was not simply to bend a piece of wood. A true English longbow could demand a draw weight of 80, 90, or even 120 pounds of force. And while numbers are easy to say, they are harder to feel when you are a boy of 12, your ribs showing beneath your tunic, your hands small, and your wrists thin. The older men in your village would tell you stories of how the longbow had won victories at Cressy and Agincourt, how walls of arrows had turned the tide of battles, how English archers had humbled the French knights clad in shining armor. They told these stories with pride, but they did not tell you how much it hurt to become strong enough to pull the bow that made those victories possible. They did not tell you about the mornings when your arms would not lift, when your shoulders felt like fire, when your fingers were swollen and stiff from the relentless grip of the string. Your father would stand beside you as you took up your bow, correcting your stance, showing you how to plant your feet, so you would not fall backward when you try to draw. He would remind you to keep your elbow high, your wrist straight, your eyes focused on the target even as your muscles trembled under the strain. There was no shortcut to mastering the longbow. There was only repetition, day after day, until the pain became a constant companion, and the bow's weight became something you could bear. You learned that the bow itself was alive in a way, responding to the weather and the moisture in the air. On damp mornings, the string would feel heavy and unresponsive, the wood would creak as you pulled, and the arrow would fly differently than it did on dry days. You had to learn to feel the bow, to understand its moods, to adjust your aim and your release with a sensitivity that came only from long hours of practice. There was no forgiveness in the bow. If your draw was weak, your arrow would fall short. If your release was sloppy, the arrow would wobble, its flight ruined before it even truly began. At first, you could only pull the bow a few inches, the resistance a wall that mocked your small muscles. But you kept trying, your arms shaking, your breath catching your chest as you struggled to pull further, to draw the string back to your ear, to feel the bow bend in your hands. There were days when you managed a full draw for the first time, the string brushing your cheek, the arrow trembling with held energy, and you felt a surge of pride that warmed you even as your arms screamed in protest. But even as you grew stronger, the weight of the longbow never truly became light. It remained a test each time you picked it up, a reminder that your body had to be ready, that your strength was not just a matter of pride, but a survival. You saw the older boys, those nearing manhood, their backs broad, their arms thick, but their bodies marked by the bow. Their shoulders were uneven, the muscles on their right side larger than their left, their fingers gnarled from years of gripping the string, their posture altered by the constant pull of the bowstring. You began to understand that the longbow was not just a weapon. It was a craft that shaped you physically, demanding a body adapted to its needs. To be a good archer was not only to have a sharp eye, but to have the endurance to draw the bow over and over, to hold it steady as you aimed, to release with control even when your muscles were trembling from fatigue. It was to have the discipline to keep practicing, to keep building strength, because the bow would not meet you halfway. You had to rise to its demands. Your practice was measured not just in arrow shot, but in the quiet soreness that settled into your muscles at the end of the day, in the way your hands would cramp when you tried to eat your supper, in the stiffness that greeted you each morning as you rolled off your straw bed. You would stretch your arms before practice, rotating your shoulders, feeling the tightness in your back with muscles that grown hard, where knots of tension formed from the constant draw and release. There were moments when you envied the boys who did not have to train with the bow, the sons of merchants who learned to read and write, who carried ledgers instead of weapons. You envied the shepherd boys who spent their days in the fields, free to run and climb and play while you stood in the practice fields, your bow in hand, your body aching from the repetition of drawing and loosing. But you also felt a quiet pride, a knowledge that you were learning something that mattered, something that would be called upon when the time came. The bow was your duty, your burden, but it was also your promise to your family, to your village, to your kingdom. It was a tool that would allow you to stand in the shield wall and send arrows flying toward the enemy, to protect your land from invaders, to earn your place among the men who had gone before you. On days when your spirit wavered, when the pain seemed too much, you would remember the stories of battles won by archers, of how arrows falling like rain had turned the tide against knights who thought themselves invincible. You would imagine yourself on the battlefield, your bow in hand, your arrows ready, your body strong enough to draw and shoot without hesitation, and it would give you the strength to keep practicing, to keep pulling the bow even when your arms burned with exhaustion. But beneath the pride, there was always the truth that the bow was heavy, that the strength it required was not easily gained, that the process of becoming an archer was one of constant physical sacrifice. The weight of the longbow was not just in the pounds of draw force it demanded, but in the toll it took on your body, in the way it shaped your muscles and your bones, in the way it carved its presence into your flesh with every pull of the string. You learned to live with this weight, to accept it as part of your identity, to measure your progress not in how easy it felt, but in how much further you could draw, how much longer you could hold the string before releasing, how many arrows you could shoot before your arms gave out. You measured your worth in the quivers emptied, in the target struck, in the way your arrows began to cluster closer together on the straw circles as your skill grew. The longbow demanded much, and it gave little in return beyond the quiet satisfaction of improvement, the nod of approval from your father or your master when your arrows flew true, the knowledge that you were becoming ready for the call that would eventually come. Because in the end, the longbow was not just a tool for practice. It was preparation for war, for the battles you would one day fight, for the moments when your strength and skill would mean the difference between life and death. You did not know then how many men you would see fall because of arrows like yours, how many would fall because of arrows you shot with your own hands. For now, you only knew the way of the bow, the way it made your shoulders burn, the way it left your fingers raw, the way it demanded that you grow stronger each day. It was enough to focus on the target, to draw the string, to feel, to release, and arrow fly. The wind across the field was constant, brushing your hair across your eyes as you raise your bow again, your breath catching in your throat, your feet planted in the cold, damp earth. The mornings were always the same. The ground was often soft beneath your boots. You've been standing there, bow in hand, arrow knocked, drawing, aiming, releasing, and again, and again. There was no magic moment when your body stopped hurting during these practices. There was only the acceptance of the pain as part of you. Your shoulders would burn first, the ache beginning as a dull throb just beneath the bones, growing sharper with every pull of the string. Your back would tighten, the muscles between your shoulder blades knotting with tension, your arms trembling as you try to hold the bow steady, trying and trying. You learn to breathe through the pain, to focus on the small circle of straw, or wood that serve as your target, to let the rest of the world fade away. Your fingers were the first to betray you. The string was rough against your skin, the constant friction burning away the softness until blisters formed, raw and painful, each touch sending a shock of pain up your arm. At first, you would flinch, your shots going wide as you tried to adjust your grip, but there was no sympathy waiting for you. Your father, or the village bow master, would simply nod and tell you to continue, because pain was part of the process, part of the price you paid for learning the craft. As the days passed, the blisters would burst, leaving raw, red skin beneath, the pain sharper now, a constant reminder with every draw of the string. You learn to wrap your fingers in scraps of cloth or leather, trying to cushion the burn, but the protection was thin and the pain still found its way through. You would wake in the mornings to find your fingers stiff, swollen, the joints aching from the constant tension, the skin cracked and rough, but there was no rest waiting for you, because if you did not practice, you would fall behind. If you could not draw your bow, could not shoot with speed and accuracy, you would fail your family, your village, your kingdom when the time came. And so, you would walk back to the field, your bow in hand, your quiver full, the weight of responsibilities settling on your shoulders as you took your place once more. Your arms grew tired more quickly as the hours passed, the bow feeling heavier with each shot, the string harder to pull. Your breath came in short gasps, your chest tightening as you fought against the fatigue that crept into your muscles, your legs shaking as you tried to steady your aim. The world would narrow down to the space between you and the target, the bowstring humming with tension, your mind whispering encouragement as you struggled to keep going. The pain became a kind of teacher, instructing you in the limits of your body, showing you where your strength was lacking, forcing you to learn how to endure. You discovered how to shift your stance, how to engage the muscles of your back instead of relying solely on your arms, how to breathe out as you release the string to steady your aim. Each small adjustment was hard-earned, paid for with the price of pain and persistence, the lessons carved into your body with every hour spent on the practice field. Your shoulders would feel the ache most deeply at night as you lay on your straw bed, your body sinking into the softness, the pain pulsing with each heartbeat. Your arms would twitch, small spasms running along the muscles, a reminder of the strain they had endured, the silent promise that tomorrow the bow would still be waiting for you. Sleep came slowly on those nights, the soreness keeping you awake, the memories of each shot playing through your mind, the successes and failures alike etched into your memory. Sometimes you would dream of the bow, of the way it felt in your hands, the tension of the string, the flight of the arrow as it leapt from your fingers. You would wake with your hands curled into fists, your fingers aching, your shoulders tight, the dream fading as you open your eyes to the dim light of dawn, the sound of the village stirring around you. Your mother would shake her head as she saw the state of your hands, the red, raw skin, the dirt and blood that clung to your fingers despite your efforts to wash them clean. She would sigh as she helped you wrap them, her eyes filled with worry that she could not speak aloud, because she knew that this was your duty, your path, that there was no other way for a boy in your position. The kingdom needed archers, and the archers needed to practice, no matter the pain. And so you would go back, your hands wrapped, your shoulders stiff, your bow in hand, ready to begin again. You would take your place on the field, the dew dampening your boots, the morning air cool against your skin, the world quiet as you knocked your first arrow. The pain would be there waiting, but you would push it aside, focusing on the target, on the feel of the bow in your hands, on the rhythm that had become a part of you. Draw, aim, release. The arrow would fly, cutting through the air, the sound of its passage a soft whisper that only you could hear, the impact of the target a dull thud that echoed in your mind. Sometimes it would strike true, sinking into the center of the circle, and a small spark of pride would warm you for a moment, a reminder that the pain was worth it, that you were improving, that you were becoming the archer you needed to be. But more often, the arrow would miss, striking the outer edges of the target or falling short, the disappointment settling into your chest like a stone. You would take a deep breath, knock another arrow, and try again, because that was the only way forward, the only way to learn, the only way to become strong enough to draw the heavy war bow that awaited you. The practice field became a place of quiet suffering, shared by the other boys who stood beside you, each of you lost in your own struggles, your own pain, your own determination. You learned not to speak of the pain, not to complain, because everyone around you was enduring the same, each of you bound together by the unspoken understanding that this was the path you had to walk. And so you practiced, until your fingers were callous and cracked, until your shoulders were broad and strong, until your arms no longer trembled with each draw, until you could shoot arrow after arrow with a steady hand and a clear eye. The pain did not disappear, but it became a part of you, a constant presence that you learned to accept, to work through, to embrace as the price you paid for your skill. Because when the time came, when the call to war sounded, when the banners were raised and the drums beat, you would need to stand among the other archers, your bow in hand, your arrows ready, your body prepared for the demands that would be placed upon it. The practice, the pain, the long hours spent on the field would all come together in that moment. The years of preparation leading to the instant when you would draw your bow, take aim, and release, the arrow flying true because you had endured, because you had learned, because you had practiced until the pain became a part of you. And even then, you would feel the ache in your shoulders, the tightness in your fingers, the weight of the bow reminding you of everything it had taken from you to reach that point. The path of the archer was not an easy one, not a path of glory and ease, but a path of discipline, of persistence, of pain embraced and overcome. Even when the church bells rang and the village gathered for mass, the bow was there, waiting. When the harvest season arrived, and the fields were filled with the rustle of grain and the heavy scent of earth, the bow was there, waiting. When festivals brought music and laughter to the village square, and children chased each other with painted masks, the bow was there, waiting. There was no escape from a bow, not for you, not for any boy born into a kingdom that lived and died by the arrow. Even on holy days, when others rested, when prayers were lifted to heavens and the village shared bread and ale, you would find yourself on the practice field, the bow in your hands, the string brushing your fingers, your eyes focused on the target that had become a constant companion. It was a law, after all, as immovable as the stones of the village church, as certain as the rising and setting of the sun. The Statute of Winchester and countless local decrees require that every able-bodied boy and man practice archery, not just on weekdays, but on Sundays and feast days, ensuring that the kingdom would never lack for archers when the call to war came. The parish constables would patrol the fields, watching, taking note of who was present, who was absent, who was improving, who was failing. Fines and punishments awaited those who did not attend, who did not practice, who did not show the proper dedication to the bow. It did not matter if your arms were sore from working the fields, if your back ached from carrying loads of wood, if your hands were blistered from a harvest. The bow did not care for your fatigue, and neither did the kingdom. The expectation was clear. You would practice, you would train, you would prepare, because one day your skill might be the thin line between victor and defeat, between survival and destruction for your village and your family. Your father understood this, even if he did not always say it aloud. He would wake you on the mornings when you could barely move, your arms stiff from the previous day's training, your fingers swollen, your shoulders tight. His eyes would be tired, his own body marked by years of labor and the weight of the bow. But he would still gesture toward the door, the silent reminder that the practice field awaited, that the bow was waiting. Sometimes you would walk to the field in silence, the morning mist clinging to the ground, the world quiet except for the soft crunch of your boots on the dirt path. The dew would soak your feet, chilling you even as your body began to warm with the effort of carrying your bow, your quiver, the the small bundle of food your mother had pressed into your hands before you left. The field itself would be alive with the sounds of practice, the twang of bowstrings, the soft thud of arrows striking straw or wood, the murmured instructions of fathers to sons, older boys correcting younger ones, the occasional sharp cry as a finger was pinched by the string or an arrowhead cut skin. The smell of grass and earth would mix with the scent of sweat and oiled wood, the air filled with the focused energy of bodies working in unison toward a single purpose. You would take your place among the others, your feet finding the familiar stance, your hands moving to knock an arrow, your eyes scanning the target, your mind settling into the rhythm that had become second nature. Draw, aim, release. The string would snap forward, the arrow would fly, and you would already be reaching for the next one. Your body moving with the practiced ease that came only from countless repetitions. Even during festivals, when the village gathered to celebrate, archery competitions were a part of the festivities, a test of skill and a reminder of duty hidden beneath the laughter and cheer. Prizes of bread, cheese, or small coins would be offered to those who could shoot the farthest, the straightest, the fastest, turning the practice into a game that masked the seriousness beneath. You would watch as the best archers demonstrated their skill, the arrows flying true, the crowds cheering, and you would feel the quiet urge to improve, to reach that level of mastery. There was pride in the skill, yes, a satisfaction in seeing your arrows strike the center of the target, in feeling your strength grow, in knowing that you were becoming capable of holding your own when the time came. But the pride was accompanied by the constant reminder that this was not a hobby, not a pastime you could abandon when you grew tired or bored. It was an obligation, a duty, a calling that you could not ignore, that you could not walk away from. You would see the older men, those who had fought in wars, who bore the scars of battle, still practicing, their bodies slower, their movements stiffer, but their eyes sharp, their focus unwavering. They, too, could not escape the bow, even as their hair turned gray and their hands shook, because the kingdom demanded that its archers remain ready, always ready, for the moment when they would be called upon once more. And so, the bow became a constant presence in your life. Its weight a familiar burden on your shoulder. Its shape a familiar silhouette against the sky. You would carry it with you as you walked through the village, as you traveled to nearby fields to work, as you visited neighbors, as you moved through the rhythms of daily life. It was a part of you, as inseparable as your own shadow, a reminder of who you were and who you were expected to become. Even in your moments of quiet, when you sat by the hearth at night, the fire crackling, the warmth seeping into your tired body, your eyes would drift to where your bow rested against the wall, its curve catching the light, its present a silent promise that tomorrow you would take it up again. It was there when you woke in the morning, when you ate your meals, when you dreamed your dreams, a part of your life that could not be ignored, could not be left behind. You would sometimes wish for a day without the bow, a day when you could rest, when you could allow your body to heal, when you could simply be a boy, free from the expectations that weighed upon your shoulders. But those days never came, because the bow was always there, waiting, and the world you lived in allowed no escape from the responsibilities that came with it. You would hear the stories of battles fought, of archers who had turned the tide, who had stood their ground against knights in shining armor, who had rained arrows upon the enemy until the field was littered with the fallen. You would feel a thrill at those stories, the sense of pride that you were training to become one of them. But beneath that pride was the knowledge that those stories were paid for with sweat and pain, with bodies broken by the way of the bow, with lives spent in service to a duty that demanded everything. There was no escape from the bow, no matter how much you might wish for it, no matter how tired you became, no matter how much your body ached. It was your path, your purpose, your burden, and your companion, and it would remain so for as long as you drew breath. Chapter 2, Tools of the Trade, Bow and Arrows. In the quiet of early dawn, when the mist still hugged the earth and the sky was soft with the promise of morning, you would reach for your bow with care, as it were a living creature needing your gentleness to wake. You had spent years learning to draw it, to feel its weight, to measure your strength against its resistance. But the truth that no one could ignore was that the bow, for all its power, was fragile. A medieval longbow was made from you if you were lucky, elm, or ash if you were not. Each piece was chosen carefully, each curve shaped by a craftsman who understood the tree's life inside the grain. The bow needed to be strong and flexible, able to bend without breaking, able to hold the tension of the string as you pulled it back to your cheek, the arrow waiting for release. The wood was shaped and seasoned, the outer layer, the sapwood, left to face the target, while the inner heartwood, stronger and darker, faced you, bearing the strain of each draw. It was beautiful in its simplicity. A single piece that would curve into a weapon that could send an arrow farther than a man could run in moments, that could pierce through leather and mail, that could change the course of a battle. And yet, for all its strength, the bow was vulnerable. It was vulnerable to weather, to the damp that would creep into wood on a rainy day, making it soft and unresponsive, reducing its power, weakening its tension. It was vulnerable to the heat that would dry the wood too quickly, causing cracks to appear, tiny lines that would grow with each draw until one day the bow would snap in your hands with a sound like a breaking branch, leaving you exposed and unarmed. As a young archer, you learned to fear the rain, to fear the heavy clouds that gathered above the village, the smell of earth that rose as the first drops fell, reminding you that your bow was at risk. You would rub it with wax or grease, try and protect it, try and keep the damp from seeping into the fibers, but you knew that the protection was never perfect, that each day of rain was a test of your care, your vigilance. You would wrap your bow in cloth when you were not using it, keeping it close to your body for warmth, hoping that your own heat would drive away the moisture that threatened to weaken it. In the summer, when the sun was high and the air was dry, you would worry about the opposite. The heat could dry the wood too much, making it brittle, making it crack under the strain of a full draw. You would store your bow in shaded places, away from the harsh sun, hanging it carefully to avoid warping, checking it each day for signs of dryness, for the small splinters that could appear along the curve. You would rub oil into the wood, your fingers moving carefully along its length, feeling for the smallest imperfections, the hints of damage that could become a break if ignored. The string itself was another vulnerability, made from hemp or flax, twisted tightly to hold the tension. It was a lifeline for the bow's power, but it, too, was fragile. Rain would cause it to loosen, the fibers swelling with moisture, reducing the string's tension, making your shots weaker, less accurate. In the heat, the string could dry out, becoming brittle, the fibers cracking under pressure, ready to snap at the worst moment. You learned to wax your string regularly, to check it for fraying, to replace it when it began to show signs of wear, even if replacing a string meant hours of careful twisting, of testing and adjusting, of learning the right tension by feel alone. During practice, you would see the fear in the eyes of the boys around you when a bow broke. It happened suddenly, a sharp crack like lightning splitting a tree, the bow snapping in two, the pieces flying apart, sometimes cutting the archer's arm or face, leaving a thin line of blood as a reminder of the danger. The broken bow was a symbol of loss, of failure, of the end of a tool that you had trusted, that you had carried and cared for, that you had relied upon to protect yourself and those around you. And in war, when the rain fell on muddy fields and the air was filled with the sounds of shouting and the clash of steel, when your hands were slick with rain and sweat, when you stood among your fellow archers, the fear of a breaking bow was a shadow over every shot. You would watch the sky, watch the rain, feel the damp creeping into the wood, and you would pray that your bow would hold, that the next draw would not be the last, that you would not find yourself unarmed in the middle of the chaos. Your bow was more than a weapon. It was your companion, your lifeline, your promise of survival. You learned to care for it with a devotion that went beyond necessity, because you understood that it was not invincible, that its power depended on your care, your attention, your willingness to protect it from the elements, from neglect, from the small damages that could grow into fatal breaks. There were moments in the quiet after practice when you would sit with your bow across your knees, your fingers tracing the curve of the wood, feeling the life inside it, the memory of the tree it once was, the strength and flexibility that it offered you. You would check the string, tightening it carefully, listening to the note it sang when plucked, a soft hum that promised power if respected, danger if ignored. You learned to respect your bow, to understand that its fragility was part of its nature, that its power was a gift that came with responsibility. You could not escape this truth, just as you could not escape the bow itself. It became a lesson in humility, in patience, in care, teaching you that strength was not the absence of vulnerability, but the ability to manage it, to live with it, to protect what was important even when it was fragile. And so, As a medieval archer, you carried your bow with you everywhere, watching the sky, feeling the air, checking the wood and the string, knowing that your life and the lives of others might one day depend on your ability to keep this fragile piece of wood ready, to ensure that when the moment came, you could draw and shoot, and the bow would not fail you. It was a burden you accepted, because you had no choice, because the world you lived in was one of constant preparation, of readiness for the battles that would inevitably come. Your bow was your tool, your weapon, your partner, and you learned to live with fragility, to care for it as you care for yourself, because in the end, its strength was your strength, its survival was your survival, and its breaking could mean your end. You would think that arrows were simple things, just shafts of wood with feathers on one end and a point on the other, made to be shot and forgotten, replaced easily with the next. But in the world you lived in as a medieval archer, every arrow was precious, each one a small investment of time, labor, and resources that could not be wasted lightly. An arrow was not merely a stick. It was a careful piece of craftsmanship. The shaft needed to be straight and strong, made from ash or birch or another wood that would not warp easily, that could withstand the force of being shot from a powerful longbow, that would fly true through the air. The fletching, the feathers tied to back end, needed to be placed precisely, angled and spaced to guide the arrow in a smooth, spinning flight, stabilizing it so it would not wobble and lose its aim. Feathers came from birds. Goose feathers were prized, and the best fletchers would sort them carefully, choosing those of equal size and flexibility, matching them to ensure consistency across the arrows you carried. Each feather was trimmed and bound with thin cord or glue made from animal hides, secured so they would not slip or tear away in flight. It was delicate work, often done by candlelight or by the glow of the hearth, requiring steady hands and a patient spirit. Then there was the point, the arrowhead, which could take many forms depending on its purpose. A simple bodkin point, narrow and hardened, designed to pierce armor, a broadhead with wide, sharp edges, meant to cause terrible wounds to unarmored soldiers or hunting animals. Arrowheads were made by blacksmiths, shaped from iron, sometimes steel, each one requiring the work of a skilled hand to forge, sharpen, and fit onto the shaft securely. The cost of these materials added up quickly, and the labor of the fletcher and the blacksmith was not cheap, even for those serving in a lord's retinue, who might be given a supply of arrows. The number was limited, and the expectation was that you would retrieve what you could after practice or battle. Arrows were not to be wasted, not to be left behind if it could be helped, because each one represented effort and expense that could not easily be replaced. During practice, you would often find yourself walking down the field after a round of shooting, your eyes scanning the grass and dirt for feathered ends of your arrows, your hands reach and pull them carefully from the target or the earth where they had landed. Sometimes they would break on impact, the shaft splintering, the arrowhead bending or snapping off, and you would feel a small pang of loss, knowing that this was another piece of your small arsenal gone, another cost of air. In battle, retrieving arrows was even more difficult. The field would be chaos. Bodies lie where they had fallen, the ground churned by horses and men, mud and blood mixing underfoot. Arrows would be scattered everywhere, some embedded in shields or armor, others buried in the ground, many broken, trampled, lost in confusion of the fight. After the battle, you might walk the field, looking for those that could be salvaged, pulling them from the ground, cleaning the mud from the fletching, checking the shafts for cracks, hoping to recover what you could. But even with care, arrows were always in demand, always in need of replacement, and the cost was a burden that archers bore silently. For those who were not wealthy, who did not have a lord's patronage to supply their weapons, acquiring enough arrows to be ready for war was a constant challenge. Some would trade goods or services, others would work extra hours, saving coins to pay the fletcher and the blacksmith, piece by piece building the supply they needed. You learned to value each arrow, to handle them with care, to store them properly so that the feathers would not bend, the shafts would not warp, the points would not rust. Your quiver was not simply a container, but a guardian of your small treasures. Each arrow counted and inspected before practice, before travel, before battle. Losing an arrow was like losing a small part of your strength, a reminder that your resources were limited, that your ability to fight depended on maintaining what you had. Sometimes, in the quiet moments before practice, you would find yourself inspecting your arrows, your fingers running along the smooth wood, testing the tightness of the fletching, the sharpness of the point. You would feel the weight of each one, learning their balance, the subtle differences between them, the way they felt when knocked to the string. You knew that a well-made arrow could mean the difference between a hit and a miss, between striking down an enemy or seeing your shot fall harmlessly to the ground. There was pride in maintaining your arrows, in caring for them as you cared for your bow, in knowing that you were prepared for what was to come. But there was also the quiet anxiety that came with knowing that they were finite, that each shot you took was a small expense, that each arrow loose was an arrow that might be lost, broken, or taken by the enemy. And there was anger, too, sometimes when you saw arrows wasted, shot carelessly, left behind without a second thought. You understood what it took to make them, what it cost to buy them, what it meant to lose them. Each arrow was more than a tool. It was a symbol of your readiness, your commitment, your ability to stand in battle when the time came. Losing one was losing a piece of that security, a small reminder of the fragility of your preparedness. Even in moments of success, when your arrow flew true and struck the target with a satisfying thud, there was a knowledge that the arrow's journey was not over. You would walk to retrieve it, hoping it had not broken, hoping the point had not bent, hoping the shaft was still true. You would pull it from the target, inspect it quickly, and return it to your quiver, ready to be used again, to fly again, to serve its purpose once more. This cycle of use and care, of loss and replacement, became part of your life as an archer, another quiet burden you carried alongside the weight of your bow and the expectation of your training. It was a reminder that even the tools of your trade came at a cost, that nothing was truly free, that every shot you took was an investment you could not afford to waste. In the end, you learned to shoot with precision not just because it was your duty, not just because it was your skill, but because you could not afford the luxury of carelessness. Each arrow was precious, each one a small promise to yourself and to those who relied on you that when the time came, you would be ready, that you would not waste what you had, that you would stand with your bow and your arrows, prepared for the moment when your skill would be needed most. Among all the parts of your equipment as a medieval archer, there was one part so small, so easily overlooked by those who did not carry a bow, yet was as vital as your breath, the bowstring, a simple length of twisted fiber, stretched tight between the tips of your bow. It held the power to send your arrow flying, to give life to your skill, to be the voice of the longbow you had spent so many hours learning to draw. You learned early that the bowstring was not something to take for granted. It was made most commonly of hemp or flax, twisted into cords with just the right tension, thick enough to hold the strain of the draw, yet not so thick that it slowed the arrow's flight. It could also be made from silk for those with means or sinew for those who hunted and prepared the material themselves, each choice requiring knowledge, time, and effort. Making a bowstring was a craft in itself, often done by the archer or by a bowyer, twisting the fibers with care, binding them with wax or resin to protect them from the damp, smoothing them with fingers to find any imperfections that might cause a weak spot. A single loose twist, a rough knot, or a hidden break in the fiber could mean the difference between a clean shot and the snap of the string, leaving you holding a bow that could no longer serve its purpose. The moment of a string breaking was a shock, a sharp sound like a whip crack, the sudden loss of tension sending a vibration to bow and into your hands, sometimes snapping back to cut your wrist or your face, leaving welts or even drawing blood. It could happen during practice, ruining your day's training, but worse was when it happened in battle, leaving you defenseless at the worst possible moment, scrambling to replace it while chaos raged around you. Because of this, you learned to treat your bowstring with the same care you gave to your bow, checking it each morning, running your fingers along its length to feel for fraying or thinning, applying wax to protect it against the rain and damp that were your constant enemies. You would tighten it carefully, ensuring the tension was right, testing the sound it made when you plucked it gently, a soft note that told you it was ready, that it was strong enough to carry the power of your draw. The rain was always a threat. Moisture could seep into the fibers, causing them to swell and loosen, reducing the string's tension, weakening your shots, and making the bow feel sluggish in your hands. The string would sag, and each draw would feel different, the arrow's flight less true, the distance you could shoot shortened by feet. That could mean everything in a real fight. You would try to keep your bow and string dry, wrapping them in cloth, sheltering them under your cloak, but the weather was not always kind, and there were days when the damp was unavoidable. In the summer, the The sun could dry the string too much, making it brittle, the fibers cracking under the strain of repeated draws. You would see small splits in the material, the warning signs of coming break, and you would feel the tension in your chest as you decided whether to replace the string now, losing precious time, or to trust it for just a few more shots, hoping it would hold until the end of your practice or the end of the battle. Bowstrings were not cheap to replace. For many archers, each string was a carefully guarded resource, something to be used and maintained for as long as possible, only replaced when absolutely necessary. Some archers would keep spare strings wrapped in wax cloth, carried in a pouch at their belt, ready for the moment when a replacement was needed, knowing that a broken string without a replacement could render even the strongest, most skillful archer powerless. The act of changing a bowstring was itself a skill. The tension of the string meant that it had to be fitted carefully, the loop at each end sliding over the nocks at the tips of the bow. The string twisted and adjusted until it had the correct brace height, the distance from the string to the grip when the bow was strung. Too loose, and the bow would lack power. Too tight, and the string could snap under the pressure, or the bow could warp over time, weakening its limbs. You learned to do this quickly, efficiently, sometimes in the dark before dawn when you prepared for practice, sometimes in the heat of battle, your hands moving automatically even as your heart pounded, as the sounds of shouting and clashing steel filled the air around you. You learned to listen to the feel of the string, to know by touch and sound whether it was ready, whether it would hold, whether it would carry your arrow true when you released. In those moments, you realize how much depended on this slender cord, how your training, your strength, your skill, all came down to whether the bowstring could endure, could hold the tension you demanded of it, could survive the demands of rain, heat, and repeated use. It was a lesson in humility, in respect for the tools of your craft, in understanding that even the smallest, simplest part of your equipment was as vital as your own breath. Your relationship with your bowstring became one of careful partnership, a quiet agreement between you and the twisted fibers that connected your power to your arrow. You would care for it, protect it, replace it when needed, and in return it would serve you faithfully, carrying your arrows toward their targets, giving life to the silent skill you had spent so many years developing. At night, when you returned home, your fingers raw from practice, your shoulders aching from the repeated draws, you would unstring your bow to let it rest, to preserve its shape, and you would check the string once more, smoothing it, inspecting it, ensuring it was ready for tomorrow. It was a ritual that became part of your daily life, a moment of quiet reflection that reminded you of the fragile balance upon which your readiness depended. You would lie down to sleep, your body sinking into the straw mattress, your mind already turning toward the next day, the next practice, the next moment when you would take up your bow again. The bowstring would be there, ready, waiting, a small but essential promise that you could do what you needed to do, that you could draw and release, that you could fulfill your duty when the time came. And so, in the world of medieval archer, the bowstring was more than just a cord. It was a lifeline, a quiet, constant presence that demanded care and attention, that reflected the fragile strength upon which your skill and survival depended. You learned to respect it, to honor it, to understand that even in a life filled with harsh challenges, sometimes it was the smallest things that mattered most that determined whether you would stand ready or be left powerless in the moments that counted. When you think of an army, you might imagine neat lines of soldiers, each one holding the same weapon, each arrow the same length, the same weight, the same shape, flying in perfect arcs across the sky to strike the enemy as one. But in the world you lived in as a medieval archer, the truth was far different and far messier. There was no single standard for the arrows you carried in your quiver. There was no factory cutting each shaft to the same length, no precise weight measurements ensuring balance, no universal design for fletching that would guarantee consistency. Every arrow you carried was a product of individual craftsmanship, of local materials, of the hand and eye of the fletcher who made it, and each arrow had its own quirks, its own character. Some arrows were longer, built for greater stability in flight, while others were shorter, designed to be shot quickly in rapid volleys. Some were heavy, their thick shafts carried more force upon impact, while others were light, flying faster but with less power to pierce armor. The fletching varied too, depending on the feathers available, the angle at which they were tied, the skill of the fletcher. Some arrows would fly straight and true, while others would drift, turning slightly in the air, forcing you to adjust your aim with each shot. The heads of the arrows were another source of variety. Some were bodkin points, long and narrow, meant to pierce mail and armor with their focused point of impact. Others were broadheads, wide and sharp, meant to cut and cause deep wounds, more effective against lightly armored foes or for hunting. The differences were not simply academic. They changed the way the arrow flew, the way it struck, the damage it could do. As an archer, you learned to know your arrows, to remember which ones flew best, which ones required a different aim, which ones were suited for different tasks. But in the heat of battle, there was no time to carefully select a perfect arrow for each shot. You would reach into your quiver, your fingers closing around the first shaft they touched, knocking it to your string, drawing and releasing. The arrow would fly, and in that moment, you would feel the slight differences, the way it pulled against the string, the way it left your fingers, the sound it made as it cut through the air. These small differences could mean a missed shot, an arrow falling short or drifting wide. In practice, this was a frustration, a challenge you try to overcome through familiarity and skill, adjusting your aim based on your knowledge of each arrow's behavior. But in battle, it was a risk, a reminder that your tools were not uniform, that your skill was constantly tested by the inconsistency of your equipment. This lack of standardization extended to bows themselves. While many archers use long bows of similar length and draw weight, variations in wood quality, in craftsmanship, in maintenance meant that each bow had its own feel, its own rhythm. The bowstring tension could vary, the flexibility of the limbs could differ, and as an archer, you had to learn to adjust, to feel the differences with each draw, to sense the right moment to release. The arrows you carried were often made locally, using the materials available in your village or the surrounding area. If your Fletcher had access to good goose feathers, your arrows might fly well. But if you had to use lesser quality feathers, you would feel the difference with every shot. The shafts might be made from different woods, each with its own weight and flexibility. And even within a batch of arrows, there could be variations that you would discover only through use. In wealthier armies, there might be more consistency, with arrows made in large quantities under the oversight of skilled Fletchers. But even then, the variations remained, and archers learned to adapt. You would sort your arrows before battle when you could, checking for damage, testing their straightness, trying to group them by length or weight to give yourself a small measure of predictability. But once the fighting began, order gave way to necessity, and you used what you had, trusting in your training and your ability to adjust. The lack of uniform standards also meant that when you retrieved arrows from the field after a battle or after practice, you often collected arrows made by others. Arrows of different sizes, different weights, different designs. You would inspect them, deciding which could be reused, which needed repair, which were too damaged to save. Your quiver will become a collection of mismatched tools, each with its own quirks, a small reflection of the larger reality that medieval archery was as much about adaptability as it was about skill. This inconsistency forced you to develop a deep familiarity with your tools, to pay attention to the small details, to learn to read the behavior of each arrow as it left the bow. You learned to compensate for a heavier arrow's slower flight, to adjust your aim for a lighter arrow's tendency to drift, to recognize the slight differences in trajectory that could make the difference between a hit and a miss. It was a skill that could not be taught in a single lesson, a knowledge that came only through long hours of practice, through the repetition of drawing, aiming, and releasing, through the quiet observation of each arrow's flight, each impact, each failure and success. It was a skill that turned frustration into familiarity, inconsistency into adaptability, transforming you from beginner into an archer capable of performing under the unpredictable conditions of real battle. But it was also a constant reminder that your success depended not only on your strength or your focus, but on the tools you carried, on the quality of the materials available to you, on the skill of the craftsmen who made your arrows, and on your ability to adapt to the tools you had. It was a reminder that even in the moments when you did everything right, when your aim was true and your release was perfect, the arrow might still fail you, might drift in the wind, might fall short, might miss its mark because of a flaw you could not see or control. And so, as a medieval archer, you learn to live with a lack of uniform standards, to accept it as part of your reality, to build your skill around it rather than despite it. You learned that mastery was not about perfection, but about adaptability, about the quiet confidence that came from knowing your tools well enough to adjust, to compensate, to succeed even when the odds were uneven. In the end, this was one more burden you carried, one more challenge you accepted as part of your path. You learned to trust yourself, to trust your experience, to trust your ability to overcome the small failures and the inconsistencies that marked your craft. It was not an easy path, and it demanded patience, focus, and humility. But it was the path of the archer, and it was yours to walk, arrow by arrow, shot by shot, until the day you could stand in battle and draw your bow with the quiet confidence of one who had learned to make each shot count, no matter what arrow rested on your string. Chapter 3. The Battlefield Reality. All the hours you spent on the practice field, the dawns when you woke with aching arms, the countless arrows loosened to straw targets under the watchful eyes of your father or your village constable, the days spent caring for your fragile bow, repairing your expensive arrows, maintaining your precious bowstrings, and learning to compensate for the quirks of your mismatched tools. Those were not the battle. Those were the preparation, the sharpening of your body, your patience, and your will. Because the true test, the real danger, the place where all of these lessons and hardships would be measured and judged, was the battlefield. And nothing, not the blisters on your fingers, not the bruises on your arms, not the tiredness that lived in your shoulders, could fully prepare you for the brutal reality of standing with your bow in hand, facing the chaos and the terror that came when the horns blew and the drums of war thundered across the field. You see, the archer's role in the medieval battle was essential, but it was also exposed. You were the rain before the storm, the sharp wind that announced the coming wave of steel and horse and blood. Your arrows were meant to weaken, to scatter, to disrupt the enemy ranks before they reached your lines. It was your job to send volley after volley into the advancing knights, to pierce their armor, to strike down the foot soldiers, to create confusion and fear in the enemy's hearts. But to do this, you had to be in range. And to be in range meant you had to be close enough to see the whites of the enemy's eyes, close enough to smell the sweat on their bodies, close enough to watch them lower their lances and begin their charge toward you. You would stand on the field, often at the front or on the flanks, your position dictated by the need to maximize the reach of your arrows, to send them arching over your own lines and into the advancing enemy. There were no high walls to protect you, no shields raised above your head as you drew your bow. Your only defense was the distance your arrows could create and the hope that the enemy would fall before they reached you. And so, you would stand there, your quiver full, your bowstring taut, your eyes scanning the horizon as the enemy formed ranks. The ground beneath your feet would tremble as horses stamped and pawed, the air thick with the scent of mud, iron, and fear. You would hear the orders shouted down the lines, the calls of the captains urging you to be ready, to hold, to wait for the signal. You would feel the sweat on your palms, your breath catching in your throat, your heart pounding in your chest as you raised your bow, knocked your first arrow, and drew. The first volley would be released in unison, a dark cloud of arrows rising into the sky, catching the light for a moment before they began their descent. You would watch them fall, the faint sound of their impact lost in the roar of the approaching enemy. And then you would reach the next arrow, and the next, drawing and releasing as quickly as your body would allow, your arms burning with the effort, your fingers numb from the repeated release of the string. Each arrow was a hope, a silent prayer that would find its mark, that would slow the advance, that would bring down a knight, scatter the foot soldiers, create chaos in the enemy lines. But the enemy kept coming, stepping over the fallen, closing the distance with each passing moment. The thunder of hooves grew louder, the ground shaking with the weight of armored cavalry, the air filled with the sound of shouted commands, the clash of weapons, the screams of the wounded. And you would keep shooting, because you had no choice. You could not run. The battle was around you, your comrades counting on your arrows to hold back the tide, to break the charge before it reached the infantry lines. You would keep shooting until your quiver was empty, until your arms could no longer draw the bow, until the enemy was upon you and the lines collapsed into chaos. You would see the cavalry coming, the knights in their heavy armor, their lances lowered, their horses charging forward with terrifying speed. You would see the foot soldiers advancing, shields raised, swords and spears ready, their voices shouting war cries as they close in. And you would be standing there, your bow in hand, your arrows dwindling, the line between you and the enemy shrinking with every heartbeat. You would feel the fear then, the raw, primal fear that came from knowing you were exposed, that your role on the battlefield had placed you in the path of death. The shield wall behind you was your only hope, the infantry lines that might hold back the enemy, the pikes that might stop the cavalry charge. But until they reached you, until they engulfed your position, you were in danger, vulnerable, with nothing but your bow to defend you. Some archers were given small shields, pavises, to send the ground, a small piece of cover behind which to reload and draw, but many fought without them, relying on speed and distance, on the hope that their volleys would be enough. You would try to remain calm, to keep your shot steady, to aim carefully even as the enemy came closer, the ground quaking beneath your feet, the dust rising around you, and then the clash would come. The cavalry would break through if your arrows could not stop them, their lances shattering against shields, their horses crashing into the lines, hooves trampling the fallen. The infantry would meet the enemy, swords and spears clashing, the air filled with the sounds of battle, the cries of the wounded, the screams of the dying. You would be forced to drop your bow, to draw your dagger or your small sword, to fight in the melee if you could, to survive as best you could. The training fields, the hours of practice, the maintenance of your fragile bow, the care you took with your expensive arrows and your precious bowstrings, all of it was to prepare you for this moment. But no practice could truly prepare you for fear that came when you saw the enemy's eyes as they closed the distance, when you heard the screams of the horses and the clash of steel, when you felt the ground shake beneath your feet as the battle swept over you. And yet, despite the fear, despite the danger, you would stand and shoot because that was your duty, because that was a role you had trained for, because that was what it meant to be an archer on the medieval battlefield. You would draw and release again and again until you could no longer, until the arrows were gone, until the enemy was upon you, and the battle became a storm of chaos and blood. The hardships you faced before, the cold mornings, the aching muscles, the blisters and bruises, the frustration of inconsistent arrows, the fear of a snapping bowstring, those were preparation, the sharpening of your spirit. They were the price you paid to stand in this moment, to do your part, to send your arrows flying into the enemy ranks, to hold back the tide for as long as you could. Because the true hardship, the true test, the true terror of being a medieval archer was not in the training. It was in the battle itself, in the moments when your skill and courage were tested, when your life was balanced on the tip of each arrow you loosed, when the enemy was coming and there was nowhere to run, nowhere to hide, only the bow in your hands, the arrows in your quiver, and the strength you had built through countless painful days, preparing for the day when everything you had learned would be needed most. The battlefield was not the clean, heroic place sung about in ballads, nor was it the glorious tapestry often painted on castle walls, where knights gleamed beneath banners and the ground seemed to glow beneath their horses. For the archer, the battlefield was mud, it was blood, and it was a suffocating smell of sweat and fear and death. When the rain came, and it often did in the fields of France, in the valleys of England, on the plains where armies met, mud became your constant companion, clinging to your boots, sucking at your feet, splashing onto your legs as you moved to find your footing among the lines of your fellow archers. Your bow, which you had protected so carefully, was now under threat from the damp air and the splashes that flew up from the churned earth as soldiers and horses moved across the field. You would try to keep your bow dry, wrapping it in cloth when you could, wiping it down between volleys, but the damp was relentless. The string, even waxed and cared for, would begin to slacken, the tension less sharp, the feel of the draw changing as the fibers absorbed the moisture. Each shot required you to adjust, to feel the change in your bow, to account for the heaviness, the air, and the sluggishness in the string, to send your arrows forward with as much accuracy and power as you could muster despite the conditions. Your arrows themselves were victims of the mud. As you pulled them from the ground between volleys, the feathers might be caked with dirt, the shafts smeared with wet earth that clung and slowed their flight, disrupting the balance you had learned to rely upon. You would wipe them on your tunic, on the grass, on your already muddied hands, trying to clean them enough to fly straight, but you could not always remove the grime entirely. When you shot, the mud on your fingers transferred to the string, to the knock of the arrow, adding weight, changing the release, sometimes causing the string to slip at the wrong moment. sending your arrow wide or making it tumble in the air before it fell uselessly to the ground. Each missed shot was not simply a missed opportunity, but a reminder of how fragile your effectiveness was on the battlefield, how the mud itself was an enemy you fought alongside the soldiers across the field. And then there was the blood. It came first as a scent on the wind, a sharp, metallic tang that mixed with the sweat of men and the dampness of the earth, that seeped into your nostrils and settled in your throat, making it hard to swallow. As the enemy advanced, as your arrows found their marks, the blood would appear on the ground, darkening the mud, turning it into a thick, sticky mess that clung to your boots with every step. You saw it on your arrows when you recovered them, the sharp head stained dark, sometimes still lodged in the bodies of the fallen, requiring you to pull with a sickening sound as the arrow came free, the feathers brushing against blood-soaked clothing, the shaft smeared with the last warmth of life ended. You learned to wipe them clean as best you could, to inspect them for damage, to return them to your quiver to be used again, because you could not afford to waste any part of your arsenal, even if it was stained with blood. The blood was not just of the enemy. It was your comrades, your fellow archers who fell beside you when the enemy's arrows found their mark, or when a cavalry charge broke through the lines, trampling men beneath iron hooves, leaving bodies crushed and bleeding in the mud where you stood. You would have to step over them, around them, your boots sliding in a mixture of mud and blood, the screams of the wounded filling your ears as you tried to focus on your task, on your next shot, on your next breath. There were times when the mud and the blood combined into a thick, cloying paste that made every movement difficult, pulling at your legs, threatening to steal your boots, to trip you as you stepped back to find a better position, as you tried to avoid the bodies that littered the field. The stench rose around you, a reminder that each step you took was across the place where men had fallen, where life had ended, where your arrows had struck their targets, fulfilling the purpose for which you had trained so long. In these moments, the discipline you had built during your years of practice was tested more than ever. You had to force yourself to keep moving, to keep shooting, to keep your mind focused even as the reality of war pressed in around you, even as the mud sucked at your feet, and the blood stained your hands, and the cries of the dying pulled at your mind like a weight threatening to drown you. You would feel the exhaustion in your body, the burn in your shoulders as you drew your bow again and again, the numbness in your fingers from the cold, and the damp and the repeated snap of the string. Your back would ache, your legs would tremble from the effort of standing in the slippery, uneven ground. Your breath would come in ragged gasps as the battle continued, relentless, demanding, uncaring of your fatigue. There was no glamour here, no songs to be sung about the archer in the mud, standing in blood, trying to knock the next arrow with hands that shook, trying to see the enemy through the haze of smoke and rain, trying to find a clear shot while bodies fell around him. There was only the need to keep going, to keep shooting, to hold the line for as long as you could, to fulfill the duty that had been drilled into you since you first held a bow in your small, unsteady hands. You would remember those moments for the rest of your life. The way the mud pulled at your legs, the way the blood stuck to your hands, the way the screams of the battlefield became a constant sound that echoed in your mind long after the battle was over. You would carry those memories with you, a weight that stayed long after the bruises healed, long after the blisters faded, long after the mud was washed away from your boots. Because for the medieval archer, the battlefield was not a place of glory. It was mud, and it was blood, and it was a hard, relentless reality of what your training had prepared you for. It was a place where all the hardship of your practice found its true purpose, where the pain you had endured became the skill that allowed you to stand and shoot, to send your arrows into the chaos, to do your part even as the world around you fell into darkness. And in that place, you learned what it truly meant to be an archer, not in the clean fields of your village practice range, not in the competitions of the feast days, but there in the mud, in the blood, in the harsh, brutal heart of the medieval battlefield. You may think of medieval archers as warriors protected by sturdy armor, safe behind walls of steel, loosing arrows from behind the safety of thick plates and heavy shields. But for most archers, armor was a luxury, a cost too high, a burden too heavy, and a promise that could not be kept when the battlefield demanded speed and flexibility above the slow, suffocating security of iron. The reality was far simpler and far harsher. You would step onto the battlefield wearing the same boots you wore in the fields, The same rough woolen leggings that scratch your skin, a tunic stained with sweat and patched over the years. If you were fortunate or under a well-equipped lord, you might be given a padded jack, thick with layers of cloth sewn tightly together, perhaps a leather jerkin stiffened with wax, offering some protection against the glancing blow of a blade or the stray cut of a spear. But against the charge of a knight's lance, against the swing of a sword, against the crush of a hammer, these were little more than a thin layer between your flesh and the steel that sought to tear open. The reason was clear. Your role on the battlefield required movement. As an archer, you needed to find the best ground, to adjust your position as the enemy advanced, to bend and twist and draw your bow to its full length without the restriction of plate armor pressing against your chest and arms. Your bow demanded your body to move, to pull back, to hold steady, to release with precision, and heavy armor made these movements clumsy, tiring, and slow. Even chainmail, with its thousands of interlinked rings, while more flexible than plate, was heavy, dragging on your shoulders and slowing your steps. It was expensive and for many archers, impossible to afford. The cost of a decent hauberk of mail could be more than a year's wages. And for a man who needed to buy arrows, maintain a bow, and feed a family, it was a dream as distant as a lord's feast. The reality was that your protection was the distance you created with your arrows, the rain of shaft that fell upon the enemy, the hope that your volleys would break their lines before they came too close. Your safety was in your skill, your speed, your ability to move quickly from one position to another, to find a high ground, to retreat when the enemy's charge threatened to overrun your line. But when the enemy closed the distance, when the horses galloped forward with lances lowered, when the foot soldiers advanced with shields raised and spears ready, your lack of armor became a curse that whispered fear into your bones. You would hear the thunder of hooves, feel the ground shake beneath your feet as the cavalry approached, the sunlight glinting off their helmets, their banners snapping in the wind. You would see the shields advancing, the lines of soldiers pressing forward, the enemy's archers loosing their own volleys in reply, the arrows falling like black rain around you, thudding into the earth, striking men beside you, sometimes striking you. If an arrow found its mark, there was little to stop it. The padded jack might slow it, might deflect if it came at a shallow angle, but a direct shot would push through the iron-tipped piercing cloth, skin, muscle, bone. You had seen it before. Seen men fall beside you, clutching the arrow protruding from their chest, their screams tearing to the sounds of battle, their blood soaking into mud, mingling with the earth. And you knew it could be you at any moment. When the cavalry charge broke through, when the foot soldiers reached your position, when the shield wall you relied upon was breached, your lack of armor left you exposed. A sword swing you could not dodge, a spear thrust you could not avoid, a mace's crushing blow. All of these were fatal, or would leave you wounded on the ground, unable to rise, the world around you turning to chaos as you try to breathe, as you try to find your bow, as you try to stand. Even if you survived, the wounds would become part of you, reminders of your vulnerability, cuts that left scars, deep bruises that turned your skin purple and black, broken bones that healed crooked. The cost of battle was not only in those who died, but in those who returned, chained forever, their bodies marked by the moments when their lack of armor failed them, when the enemy's steel found a weakness they could not hide. And yet, you would still go back, because the field needed you, because your arrows were needed to hold back the tide, because your skill with the bow was worth more than protection heavy armor could offer. You would wrap your arm with leather braces to protect against the snap of the string. You would tie cloth around your legs to shield them from the brush and the mud. But beyond that, you would walk into battle with little more than your courage and your bow, trusting your skill and your speed to keep you alive. The fear of vulnerability was constant. Before each battle, as you checked your bowstring, as you counted your arrows, as you tightened the straps of your quiver, you would feel the weight of that fear in your chest. You would look at the soldiers around you, some in mail, some in bits of plate, some with shields ready to raise against the enemy, and you would feel the thinness of your own protection, the knowledge that when the arrows fell, when the swords were drawn, when the lines clashed, you were exposed. You learned to live with that fear, to bury it beneath the focus of your task, to trust in your training, to trust in your arrows, because that was all you had. Your bow was your defense, your distance was your shield, your skill was your armor. And on the days when the battle was won, when your arrows had flown true, when the enemy had been broken before they could reach your line, you would feel a small flicker of triumph, a quiet confirmation that your skill had kept you safe, had done its duty. But even then, the fear never left, because you knew that the next battle might not be the same, that the next charge might reach you, that the next volley of arrows might find you. You would check your bow again, check your arrows, tighten your bracers, and step forward once more, your body light, your protection minimal, your mind sharp, because that was the life of a medieval archer. You were the storm before the clash, the arrow before the blade, the precision before the chaos. And you did it all with little to protect you, standing in the mud, beneath the rain, under the dark clouds of war, trusting the bow in your hand and the arrows at your side, hoping there would be enough to keep you standing for one more battle, for one more day. The morning before battle was a moment of uneasy quiet, the mist still clinging to the grass, the air holding its breath as if the earth itself hesitated to witness what was to come. You would stand among your fellow archers, your bow in your hand, your quiver full, your mind turning over the lessons you had learned from the countless days of practice, the long hours spent building strength and precision, the careful care of your fragile bow, your costly arrows, your precious bowstring. Yet as you looked toward the distant rise where the enemy would soon appear, you knew that all that had only prepared you for this, for movement, for urgency, for the restless dance of survival while under fire. Because the life of an archer in battle was not stillness, was not standing in one place while loosing arrows at your leisure. It was motion. It was adapting with every heartbeat, with every shout of command, with every step of the advancing enemy. You could not remain where you were for long, for the battlefield was a shifting ground, and the enemy's arrows and cavalry were always searching for your line, always seeking the gaps, the weaknesses, the moment of hesitation that would bring death crashing down upon you. When the order came, you would step forward, raising your bow, drawing, aiming, and releasing, the arrow leaping away from you with a whispering hum, joining the dark cloud of shafts flying into the gray sky. Your arm would burn with the effort, your breath coming quickly as you reach for the next arrow, knocking, drawing, releasing again. There was no time to savor the flight, no time to watch where it landed, for already the captains were calling for you to shift, to reposition, to move toward the left flank or to higher ground, to keep your line alive and effective. And so you would move, the mud pulling at your boots, the grass slick beneath your feet, the uneven ground of the battlefield reminding you with every step that your footing could betray you. You would move with your bow gripped in your hand, your quiver bouncing at your side, the arrows rattling softly, your eyes scanning the field for where you were needed, where your arrows could best find their purpose. All the while, the enemy's arrows would be falling, dark streaks in the sky that turned into the deadly hiss of shafts passing close, into the dull thuds of impacts around you, into the cries of men struck beside you. You would feel the wind of an arrow brushing past your ear, would see the sudden, jerking movement of a comrade as a shaft struck him, would step around the fallen as you moved. Your mind tried to remain calm even as your heart pounded. You would reach your new position, planting your feet, draw your bow again, forcing your mind to steady itself despite the chaos around you, despite the screams, despite the thunder of cavalry in the distance, despite the rain of enemy arrows seeking you out. You would draw and release, again and again, your muscles aching, your fingers numb, your breath fogging the cold air if the battle was fought in winter, sweat streaming down your face if it was fought in summer. And then, once again, the call would come to move. Perhaps the cavalry was shifting, threatening your flank, requiring you to pull back to a safer position to continue your volleys. Perhaps the infantry lines were advancing, and you needed to move forward to remain within effective range. Perhaps the enemy's archers had found your current position, and you needed to shift to avoid becoming a target, to keep your line from breaking, to remain alive. There was never rest. You would move, you would shoot, you would move again, your body aching from the repeated effort, your mind straining to focus on each shot even as exhaustion crept into your limbs. The battlefield was alive with motion, and you were part of that restless current, forced to adapt with each moment, forced to keep shooting even as your body begged you to stop. Sometimes you would find yourself climbing a slight rise, your boots slipping on the mud, your hands gripping the earth to steady yourself, your bow awkwarding your grip as you tried to reach a better vantage point. Sometimes you would be forced to run across open ground, your heart in your throat as you felt the eyes of the enemy upon you, the arrows falling around you, the shouts of your comrades urging you onward. Sometimes you would crouch low behind a small rise, taking a breath, your muscles trembling, before standing once more to loose another volley. Your arrows were your purpose, but they were also your burden, their weight growing heavier with each step, each movement, each moment of fear that pressed down upon your shoulders. You had to manage them carefully, to ensure you had enough for when the enemy came close, to resist the urge to lose them all in a desperate attempt to turn the tide too soon. You had to think, even as you moved, even as you shot, even as the battlefield demanded everything from you. And always, there was a fear that your movement would not be enough, that your speed would fail you, that the enemy would find you before you could find a new position. The fear that the cavalry would break through, that the infantry would advance too quickly, that you would find yourself too close, your bow becoming useless in press of melee, forcing you to draw your small knife, your dagger, to defend yourself in a fight you were never meant to fight. In those moments, you would feel the fragility of your role, the thin line you walked between being the storm of arrows that broke the enemy's charge and being swept away by the chaos that followed. You would feel the weight of each step, each decision, each arrow you loose into the air, knowing that your movement, your speed, your ability to remain just beyond the enemy's reach was the only thing keeping you alive. And yet you would move, you would rise, you would shoot, you would shift, you would find the next position, you would draw your bow once more, ignoring the burning in your shoulders, ignoring the shaking in your hands, ignoring the fear that clawed at the edges of your mind. You would move because you had to, because your role as an archer demanded it, because the battle demanded it, because your survival demanded it, because that was the truth of being a medieval archer. The battle did not wait for you, and you could not wait for it. You had to be ready to move, to adapt, to fight, to live within the chaos of mud and blood, of arrows and steel, of the restless, shifting ground of the battlefield. And when the day was done, if you were lucky enough to still stand, you'd feel every step you had taken, every moment of movement etched into your muscles, every memory of the battlefield imprinted on your mind. You would remember how it felt to move under fire, how it felt to keep going when everything around you screamed for you to stop, how it felt to fulfill the role you had trained for, even in the heart of chaos. Because for the medieval archer, constant movement under fire was not a choice. It was the reality of survival, the reality of battle, the reality of war. Chapter 4. The Physical Cost. After the battles ended, after the arrows had been loose and the mud and blood of the field were left behind, you returned home with your bow, your quiver lighter, your mind heavy with the memories of what you had seen, what you had survived. But even in the quiet of your village, the price of being an archer never left you. It lived in your body, in the way your shoulders ached, in the way your back pulled with every breath, in the way your muscles settled into shapes dictated not by nature, but by the longbow you had carried for so many years. Your journey to becoming an archer had begun with small pains, blisters on your fingers, the trembling in your arms after a day of practice, the stiffness in your back when you lay down at night. At first, these pains faded with rest, reminders of your growing strength, signs that your body was adapting to the demands of the bow. But as the years passed, as you grew stronger, as you learned to draw heavier bows, as you practiced hour after hour, day after day, the small pains became something else. The longbow was not a gentle teacher. It demanded that you pull with your back, your shoulder, your arm. The string taut, the bow bending with the force you gave it, each shot requiring the coordinated effort of muscles and bones working in unison. And because you drew the bow with the same arm, the same shoulder, over and over, your body began to change. You would notice at first in your reflection, in the way your drawing arm grew thicker, the muscles standing out beneath your skin, your forearm and bicep hardening with the repetition of pulling the bowstring back to your ear. Your chest would begin to feel unbalanced, one side more developed, your shoulder on that side rising slightly higher, the muscles forming a ridge beneath your skin. Others would see it too. They would comment on your strength, on the power in your arms, perhaps with a touch of envy, but they did not see the discomfort that came with it, the way your body pulled itself out of alignment, The way your spine twisted slightly to accommodate the constant motion of drawing the bow. The way your other shoulder felt weaker, neglected, unable to match the power of the side that bore the weight of your skill. As you continued to shoot, as you continued to train, the imbalance grew more pronounced. Your shoulder blades, those silent bones beneath your skin, adjusted to movement, the muscles pulling them into positions they were not meant to hold permanently. Your collarbone on your drawing side would shift slightly, the tendons around it thickening, the joint becoming less flexible, locked into the position required to draw a heavy bow. At first, you would notice it when you lay down to sleep, the discomfort in your shoulder, the way it pressed differently against the straw beneath you, the way it ached when you tried to find a comfortable position. Then you would feel it during the day, when you worked in the fields, when you lifted a bucket of water, when you reached for something on a shelf. The pain would flare, a sharp reminder of the cost you paid for your skill, for your duty. Some days, the ache would settle into your shoulder like a constant companion, a dull throb that pulsed with your heartbeat, reminding you with every moment that your body was no longer your own, that it had been shaped by the bow, that it would never be the same again. You would try to stretch, to ease the tension, to massage the aching muscles with your hands, pressing into the knots that formed beneath your skin. Sometimes it would help, the pain easing for a while, allowing you to move more freely. But the next day, when you picked up your bow again, when you drew the string back to your ear, the muscles would tighten once more, the familiar ache returning, the reminder that this was your life now. For many archers, the deformity was subtle, a slight curve in the back, a raised shoulder, a thicker arm. But for others, it became more pronounced, the years of shooting heavy war bows leaving their bodies visibly twisted, their spines curved, their shoulders hunched. They would walk with a slight tilt, their heads turned slightly to one side, their movements restricted by the stiffness that had settled into their joints. The older archers, those who had spent a lifetime serving with a bow, often showed the most dramatic signs. Their backs bent, their shoulders locked into positions shaped by decades of drawing the bow, their hands gnarled, their fingers permanently curled as if still gripping the string. They would wince when they moved, their joints cracking, their muscles stiff, their bodies carrying the silent testimony of a lifetime spent serving as a kingdom's archers. Yet even as your body changed, even as the pain became part of your daily existence, you continued to pick up your bow, because it was your duty, your role, the skill that had been drilled into you since you were a boy. You had spent your life preparing for battle, preparing to send your arrows into the enemy ranks, preparing to stand in the mud and the blood, your bow in your hand, your eyes scanning the field for your target. You accepted the pain because you had to. You accepted the changes in your body because there was no other way. You accepted the twisted spine, the uneven shoulders, the aching joints, because these were the marks of your profession, the signs that you had done your duty, that you had served as an archer, that you had fulfilled a role that had been demanded of you. And when you saw the young boys beginning their training, standing on the practice fields with small bows in their hands, their arms trembling as they tried to draw, you would watch them with quiet understanding. You would see their excitement, their determination, their pride when their arrows struck the target. You would see the beginnings of the same journey you had walked, and you would know the path they were on, the changes that would come to their bodies, the pain that would become their constant companion. You might offer them advice, small tips to ease the strain, to improve their form, to help them avoid the worst of the injuries. You might help them adjust their stance, show them how to use their back and shoulders correctly, how to balance their weight to protect themselves as much as possible. But you would also know that no matter what you told them, the longbow would shape them, just as it had shaped you, and that the price of becoming an archer was one they would pay, arrow by arrow, year by year, because the bow demanded it. And so, you would continue, your deformed shoulder rising slightly as you lifted your bow, your spine twisting slightly as you drew the string, your muscles tightening the familiar motion that had become part of you. You would feel the pain, and you would accept it, because it was the price you paid to stand as an archer, to fulfill your duty, to send your arrows flying into the sky. Each shot a promise kept, each release a reminder that your body, for all its aches and twists, was still capable, still ready, still serving its purpose. This was the cost of the bow, the cost of being a medieval archer, and you paid it because you had no choice. The fingers of an archer were not soft. They were not the smooth hands of a scribe turning pages of a manuscript by candlelight, nor the gentle touch of a musician plucking the strings of a harp. Your fingers, as an archer, became tools of endurance, marked by the relentless demands of the bow, shaped by the repeated friction of the string, toughened by the repetition of drawing and releasing until the calluses formed and the swelling became as familiar to you as the feel of your bow in your hand. When you first began, it was the blisters that came first. The tender skin of your fingers, unaccustomed to the roughness of the bowstring, would break after a day of practice, leaving raw patches that stung with every movement, with every touch, with every attempt to grip the string once more. You would wince as you trained, the pain sharp and bright, your hands wrapped in scraps of cloth in an attempt to shield the wounds, but the bowstring cared nothing for your pain. The blisters would burst, leaving skin that was red and weeping, but you could not stop. You had to practice. The law demanded it. Your family's safety might one day depend on it. Your worth to your Lord and your place in your company were tied to your skill with the bow. And so you continued, even as the pain made your eyes water, even as your breath caught with every shot. Slowly, the rawness would give way to roughness. The skin would thicken, the calluses forming on the tips of your fingers, on the sides where the string pressed hardest. Your thumb and your first two fingers, those most often used to draw and release, will become hardened, the skin turning pale and ridged, the edges sometimes cracking in the cold. Small splits appear in that bled when you flex your hand. You learn to live with these small wounds, to bandage them when you could, to rub them with tallow or wax to keep the skin from tearing further. But they were a part of you now, constant reminders of the hours you'd spent drawing your bow, loosing your arrows, preparing yourself for the battles you knew would come. Each callus was a record of your dedication, a silent mark of the skill you had built, the price you had paid. But calluses were not the only burden. Your fingers would swell, the joints thickening over time from the repeated strain of gripping the string, from the constant tension placed upon them as you pulled back, as you held, as you released. In the mornings, you might wake to find your fingers stiff, slow to move, the joints aching as you try to close your hand, to grasp your bow, to begin your day. The ache would settle into bones, a deep, throbbing pain that flared when the weather was cold or damp, that never fully left you even on the warmest days. Sometimes the joints would crack when you flexed them, a small sound that was a reminder of what they had endured, of the quiet damage done by years of practice and war. You would find that your grip had changed, that your fingers no longer moved as quickly or as precisely as they once did, that the fine task of threading a needle or tying a delicate knot became harder, your fingers less willing to bend, less sensitive to the touch. For some archers, the swelling became so pronounced that their fingers appeared permanently bent, curved from years of holding the bowstring, the tendons shortening, the joints locking into positions dictated not by choice but by necessity. They could still draw a bow, could still shoot, but their hands bore the unmistakable signs of their profession, the evidence of the countless arrows loosed, the unending repetitions of practice and battle. The pain would return each time you picked up your bow, the familiar sting as the string pressed into the callous pads of your fingers, the ache in your joints as you pulled back, the slight numbness that would sometimes follow after a long day of shooting. When your hands had done more than they could bear, you learned to manage the pain, to accept it as part of your craft, to see it not as an obstacle but as a companion, a reminder of your dedication. On the battlefield, your fingers were your lifeline, your connection to your bow, the instruments that transformed your strength and your skill into the flight of an arrow. You needed them to be strong, to be steady, to respond without hesitation, even in the chaos of battle, even when your breath was ragged, even when the fear was a weight in your chest. The swelling in the calluses, the thickened joints, the ridged skin were the price you paid to maintain that connection, to fulfill your duty, to survive. You would watch the young archers, the boys who were just beginning, their hands still soft, their fingers still nimble, and you would know the journey they were starting, the changes that would come to them as they learned to shoot, as they learned to endure. You might show them how to grip the string to reduce the pain, how to wrap their fingers when the blisters came, how to care for their hands to avoid infection, to ease the worst of the suffering. But you would know, as they did not yet know, that the calluses and the swelling would come, that the price was unavoidable, that the bow demanded these changes, that to become an archer meant accepting that your hands would never be the same, that your fingers would forever bear the signs of your dedication, your craft, your purpose. And in the quiet moments, when you sat alone by the fire, your bow resting nearby, your hands in your lap, you would run your thumb over the ridges of your fingers, feeling the hardness of the calluses, the roughness of your skin, the shapes that had formed over years of practice. You would flex your fingers, feeling the ache in the joints, the stiffness that came and went, the reminders of the countless arrows you had loosed, the countless times you had drawn your bow, the countless moments when your skill had been tested. In those moments, you might feel a quiet pride, a recognition that your hands told your story in a way words could not, that they carried the memory of your training, your battles, your survival. You might feel a sadness, too, for the softness you had lost, for the pain that never fully left, for the price you had paid. But above all, you would accept it, because it was the truth of your life as a medieval archer. Your fingers, swollen and calloused, were the tools of your craft, the marks of your path, the symbols of the dedication that had shaped you, the instruments through which you have fulfilled your duty. They were a part of you, and they always would be. Long before dawn, before the cock crowed or the village stirred, you would rise, your body already protesting the movement, your back stiff as you push yourself up from your straw bed, the ache spreading from your lower spine to your shoulders as you straightened slowly in the cold morning air. The day had not even begun, and already you felt the price of your life as an archer settling into your bones. When you first began, you noticed a soreness after a long day of practice. It was an ache that came after pulling the bow again and again, the muscles of your shoulders burning, the stretch in your back as you held the draw, the pull in your neck as you tilted your head, lining up your shot, aiming, releasing. At first, the ache would fade after a night's rest, replaced by a sense of strength, the satisfaction of feeling your body grow stronger under the demands of your training. But as the years passed, the ache never fully left. It settled into the small of your back, a dull, constant presence that reminded you of every arrow you had loosed, every moment you had spent with your bow in hand. You felt it when you bent to lift a sack of grain, when you stooped to pick up your child, when you twisted to reach for something on a shelf. A reminder that your back was no longer your own, that it had been claimed by the bow, by the years of training and battle that had shaped it. The act of drawing the longbow was not a small motion. It required your entire body to work in harmony, your legs grounding you, your back muscles engaging as you pulled a heavy string back to your ear, your shoulders tightening, your neck turning slightly as you aimed. The English longbow, with its draw weight of 80 to 120 pounds, demanded everything from you. And it was your back that bore the brunt of this demand over and over every day for years. As you drew, your shoulder blades pulled together, the muscles along your spine tensing and holding as you steadied your aim. Your lower back braced to support the motion, the weight of the bow pulling against your frame, the muscles tightening, holding, then releasing as you let the arrow fly. This motion, repeated countless times, day after day, year after year, carved itself into your body, leaving your back permanently marked by the strain. The pain was not only in the lower back, it crept into your upper back and shoulders, where the muscles tightened into knots that you could feel with your own fingers, hard lumps beneath your skin that never fully relaxed. Some mornings, your shoulders would feel as if they were bound in iron, the stiffness making it difficult to lift your arms, the ache spreading down into your elbows, into your wrists, into your hands. Your neck, too, was a victim of your craft, holding your head in position as you aimed, turning slightly to align your eye with the arrow, maintaining this posture while you focused, while you breathed, while you prepared to release. All of this placed a constant strain on the muscles of your neck. Over time, the muscles would tighten, the joints would stiffen, and the pain would radiate from the base of your skull down into your shoulders, a constant reminder of the countless hours you had spent mastering your skill. On cold, damp days, the pain would flare, the chill seeping into your bones, making the stiffness worse, the ache deeper. You would roll your shoulders, try to loosen the tightness, turning your head slowly from side to side, hearing the small cracks of your joints as they resisted the movement. Sometimes, the pain would be sharp, a sudden spasm that would take your breath, forcing you to pause, to wait, to let it pass before you continue with your day. Sleep offered little relief. You would lie on your straw bed, trying to find a position that eased the discomfort, shifting from side to side, placing your arm under your head, then under your pillow, seeking some small comfort. The stiffness in your back and neck would wake you in the night, forcing you to adjust, to stretch, to rub the aching muscles with your hands until you could drift back into a restless sleep. And yet, despite the pain, despite the stiffness, despite the discomfort that shadowed your every movement, you would rise each morning, take up your bow, and continue practice. Because this was your duty, your skill, your livelihood, your role in the world. You've been trained to serve, to defend, to stand with your bow on the battlefield, to send your arrows into the advancing enemy, to hold your place in the line even as the chaos of battle raged around you. The strength in your back, even as it ached, was a source of pride. It was the evidence of your dedication, of the years you had spent perfecting your craft, of the countless arrows you had loosed, of the battles you had survived. You could feel the power in your shoulders as you drew the bow, the steady tension in your back as you held, the familiarity of the motion that had become as natural to you as breathing. You would see the young men beginning their training, their backs straight, their movements quick and eager, their bodies unmarked by the pain you carried. You would watch them, remembering the days when your own back was unburdened, when the ache had not yet settled into your bones, when each shot was a promise of strength rather than a reminder of pain. You would see them struggle with the draw, see the way they shook with the effort, see the way they grimaced as they held, and you would know the path they were on, the changes that would come to their bodies, the pain that would become their companion. Sometimes, you would offer them advice, showing them how to use their back properly, how to engage their muscles efficiently, how to avoid unnecessary strain. You would correct their posture, adjust their stance, teach them how to breathe, how to move with a bow rather than against it, hoping to ease a burden that would inevitably come, to help them carry it with as little pain as possible. But you knew, as they did not yet know, that the pain would come, that the bow demanded it, that the price of becoming an archer was one paid in the quiet moments of discomfort, in the stiffness of the mornings, in the aches that never fully faded. You knew that to be an archer was to accept this pain, to carry it, to live with it, because the skill you held was worth the price, because the duty you fulfilled was greater than the discomfort you endured. And so, each day, you would pick up your bow, your back and neck reminding you of the years you had spent in service, reminding you of the path you had chosen, reminding you of the strength you had built, even as it cost you comfort, even as it cost you ease. You would draw, you would aim, you would release, and you would continue, because this was who you were, because this was what you'd been trained to do, because this was what it meant to be a medieval archer. The pain in your back and neck was part of your story, part of your identity, part of the price you paid to send your arrows flying, to stand your ground, to fulfill your duty, one arrow, one breath, one moment at a time. They said archers were the pride of the realm, the rain of arrows that turned the tide of battle, the silent protectors who could strike down an armored knight before he ever closed the distance. And in many ways, this was true. The power you held in your bow, the skill you carried in your steady hands, the knowledge of angles and wind in the arc of the arrow, all these made you valuable on the battlefield. But they did not tell you how quickly your body would pay the price. For while the knight might carry the scars of a blade or the bruises of a fall from his horse, you, as an archer, would carry a different kind of wound, one that did not bleed, one that could not be stitched shut, one that grew quietly inside your bones until it became as much a part of you as your breath. You aged before your time, in your 20s, when you should have been strong and limber, when your body should have felt light with the promise of youth. You already felt the heaviness in your joints, the stiffness in your shoulders, the ache in your spine that made it hard to rise in mornings. You would shift slowly as you woke, your muscles tight, your back reluctant to bend, your neck resisting movement until you had stretched and massaged the stiffness away, if only for a few hours. Your hands, too, felt older than they should. The swelling in your fingers, the calluses that had formed thick and ridged, the stiffness in your knuckles when you tried to close your hand around a cup or tie a knot in a rope. These were the marks of your trade, reminders of the countless arrows you had loosed, of the repetition that had carved itself into your body. By the time you reached your 30s, you felt as if you had lived twice as long. The strength was still there, in your arms, in your shoulders, and the steady pull of your bow. But it was a strength that came at a cost, a strength that required you to push through the pain, to ignore the sharp twinge in your back as you lifted your quiver, to grit your teeth as your fingers cracked and resisted each movement. You would see younger men on practice field, boys of 14 or 15, drawing their bows with the bright-eyed excitement of youth, their movements quick, their bodies eager. And you would remember when you had felt that way. You would watch them as they laughed, as they raced to retrieve their arrows, as they boasted about whose shot flew truer. And you would smile, but beneath that smile was a quiet knowledge that the years would come for them too, that the bow would demand from them what it had demanded from you. Sometimes you would catch your reflection in a pool of water or in the polished surface of a shield, and you would see the lines that formed around your eyes, the way your shoulders sloped forward slightly, the way your posture had shifted from the endless repetition of drawing the bow. You would see the gray that had begun to streak your hair earlier than it should have, the furrow in your brow that never seemed to smooth, the subtle but unmistakable signs that you had aged before your time. You felt it most when the weather turned cold, when the dampness of winter settled into the village, when the frost gathered on the grass, and the air turned sharp in your lungs. On those mornings, the stiffness in your back and shoulders was a constant presence, each movement requiring effort, each breath reminding you of the quiet damage done by the years of service you had given. And yet, despite the early aging of your body, despite the way the years had claimed your youth, you continued to rise each day, to take up your bow, to practice, to prepare, to stand ready. Because this was your role, your duty, your life. The aches and pains, the stiffness and weariness were part of the cost you paid to remain useful, to protect your family, to serve your Lord, to be ready for the battles that would come. On the battlefield, the early aging of your body was both a curse and a strange blessing. You had learned to move despite the pain, to draw your bow even when your shoulders protested, to knock your arrow even when your fingers resisted. The discipline that had aged you was the same discipline that allowed you to stand firm when fear threatened to break others, the same discipline that allowed you to keep shooting, to keep moving, to keep fighting, even when your body demanded rest. But when the battle ended, when you returned home, when the adrenaline faded, the pain would return in full, the stiffness reclaiming your joints, the heaviness settling back into your bones. You would sit by the hearth, your bow resting against the wall, your hands wrapped around a cup of warm broth, and you would feel every year you had lived, every arrow you had loosed, every day you had spent under the weight of the bow. You would sometimes wonder what your life might have been if you had not been an archer, if you had not spent your youth under the strain of the bow, if your body had not been shaped by the demands of war and duty. You would think of the farmers who, while burdened by their own labors, did not carry the same stiffness in their shoulders, who could stand straight without the dull ache that lived in your spine. You would think of the craftsmen, whose hands remained nimble, who could tie fine knots and carve delicate patterns without wincing at the stiffness in their fingers. But these thoughts would pass, because this was your life, your choice, your duty, and even as you felt the early aging in your body, you would stand each day, take up your bow, draw, aim, and release, because you knew your skill mattered, because you knew your arrows could change the course of the battle, because you knew your role was vital. The price you paid in the early aging of your body was a price you had accepted, a price you would pay again, because it meant you could stand in the line, because it meant you could do your part, because it meant you were an archer. The world saw the archer as strong, as capable, as precise, as the rain of arrows that broke the enemy before they could close in. But only you knew the truth of what it meant to carry the bow, to train each day, to serve in battle, to return home with your body marked by your craft, to age before your time under the weight of the duty you had accepted. It was a quiet truth, carried in the stiffness of your joints, in the heaviness of your breath, in the way you rose each morning to greet the day despite the pain. Because you were an archer, and this was your life. Chapter 5, the pay and position. You had spent your life preparing for the bow. You had built your strength from childhood, learned to care for your fragile weapons, paid the price of aching shoulders and swollen fingers, stood in the mud and the blood on countless battlefields, moving under fire, loosing your arrows into advancing armies, hoping your skill would turn the tide. Yet when the dust settled, when the banners were lowered and the dead were counted, your worth was measured in coins, and those coins were few, because in the medieval world, while kings and lords praised their archers, while they relied upon your arrows to weaken the enemy before the clash of steel, while they boasted the victories won by the rain of arrows that fell upon the knights and infantry of their foes. They did not value you enough to pay you as they paid others. The knight who rode onto the field in armor, who fought with sword and lance, who could afford a horse and a squire, earned a reward far greater than you, though your arrows might have protected him, though your volleys might have broken the enemy before he ever lowered his lance. You were needed, but you were not honored in the same way. A knight might receive land for his service, or ransom when he captured another knight in battle. He might be given fine clothes, gold coins, or a place at a lord's table. His status was visible, worn in the fine armor that glinted in the sunlight, carried in the proud way he walked, spoken of in the songs sung by minstrels. But you, the archer, returned home with the same tunic you had worn into battle, your bow across your back, your quiver lighter than when you had set out. If you were lucky, you received your pay in a handful of silver pennies, coins that disappeared quickly to pay for food, repairs for your bow, or a few extra arrows to replace those lost in battle. There was rarely enough left to ease the hardship of your family's daily life, rarely enough to lift you beyond the station you had been born into. If you fought under a lord, you might receive rations and a place to sleep while you served, but the promise of wealth was never yours to claim. Even the promise of plunder, so often spoken to inspire men before battle, rarely reached the archer. You were tasked with keeping your position, with shooting until your arrows were spent, with moving under fire to continue your volleys. You were not the first to enter the breach gates of a city to claim treasure or goods. That privilege was given to others, to the men at arms, to the knights and their squires. And if you fell in battle, if your arrows did not protect you, if the cavalry broke through and you were struck down, your death was noted in a ledger, your name spoken by your comrades, your lord moving on to recruit the next archer who could draw a bow and send arrows flying. There was no ransom for you, no great negotiations for your release if you were captured. You were replaceable, a tool of war value for your usefulness, not for your individuality. You knew this as you stood on the practice fields, as you drew your bow each day, as you maintained your arrows and checked your bowstring for frays. You knew this as you lined up on the battlefield, as you waited for the signal to begin shooting, as you adjusted your stance on the muddy ground to keep your balance while loosing arrow after arrow into the enemy ranks. It did not stop you from doing your duty. It did not stop you from drawing your bow, from aiming, from releasing, from sending your arrows to find their marks, because it was your skill, your craft, your place in the world. You had been trained for this, and you had accepted the price. But there were moments, quiet moments, when you sat by the hearth at night, your hands raw, your back aching, your mind remembering the day's practice or the last battle you fought, when you allowed yourself to think of the unfairness of it. You allowed yourself to remember the knights who rode past you on the battlefield, their armor shining, their lances ready, their voices calling commands as you stood in the mud, drawing and releasing, as your arms burned and your fingers bled. You would think of the pay you had received, the few coins that jingled in your pouch, the way they disappeared as quickly as they came, spent on necessities rather than comforts, on repairs rather than rewards. You would think of the songs sung in the halls, the stories told of the knights who won glory, who earned praise, while your role was often left unspoken, your contribution lost in the noise of the stories told by those who had never stood in your place. And you would feel the quiet weight of that truth. You were not alone in this. Other archers felt it too. You would hear them speak of it when you gathered to practice, when you shared a drink after training, when you sat together near the campfire before battle. They would joke about it, calling themselves the poor men with strong backs, or the kings of pennies, laughter tinged with quiet acceptance that came from knowing this truth could not be changed. Because the realm needed you, but it did not pay you well. It honored your skill when convenient. It praised your arrows when they won the day. But when it came time to share the wealth, to share the rewards, your share was small, your portion light. Yet, despite this, you continued. Because what else could you do? This was your craft, your place, your skill. The bow was a part of you. The arrow is your voice on the battlefield. The rhythm of draw, aim, release as natural to you as breathing. You found pride in your accuracy, in the way your arrows struck true, in the knowledge that you had done your part, that you had stood your ground, that you had served as an archer should, even if the pay was less than that of a knight, even if the glory was given to others, even if your worth was measured in pennies. You were an archer, and that was enough. If you were born to the bow, your life was one of constant preparation, constant practice, constant readiness. But there was another quiet, heavy truth tied to the life of a medieval archer. You were often expected to fund your own war. The realm needed your arrows. Your lord needed your skill. Your community relied on your practice to protect them in times of trouble. Yet the bow you carried, the arrows you loosed, the strings you replaced, the bracers on your arms, and the simple tools you used to care for your equipment, these were not always provided. They were often your responsibility, your cost to bear, your burden as much as your skill. To the outside eye, a bow was a simple tool, a curved stave of wood, a string, a handful of arrows, and a leather quiver. But to you, each part was a carefully chosen piece, each requiring time, resources, and skill to maintain. Each part demanded coin, and often that coin came from your own meager earnings. Your bow itself was a heart of your craft, and a good longbow was not cheap. Crafted from yew or elm, shaped carefully, seasoned properly, the stave alone could cost more than many peasants could afford a year, especially if it was well-made and capable of handling the heavy draw weight needed in battle. If your bow cracked or snapped in the cold, if it warped in the rain, if it was damaged in battle, you were responsible for replacing it, and the cost did not end there. Your bowstring, that small, vital length of twisted hemp or flax, was a lifeline in battle. You needed to have extras, ready to replace quickly if your string frayed or snapped under the strain of a heavy draw, under the damp of a misty morning, or in the chaos of a muddy battlefield. Making good bowstring required skill, but even if you made it yourself, the wax, the fiber, and the time it took cost you something. If you bought it ready-made from a bowyer, it cost you even more. Then there were your arrows. Arrows were not simply sticks. Each required a straight, well-seasoned shaft, often of ash or birch. They required fletchings, often goose feathers, tied with precision to guide the arrow's flight. They required an iron or steel point, forged by a blacksmith, shaped for armor piercing or hunting, depending on your needs. Each arrow you loosed in practice, each arrow you fired in battle, was a small investment leaving your hands, an investment that might be broken, lost, or buried in the mud of a battlefield, never to be recovered. And you could not simply have a few arrows if you wanted to be ready for war. A proper archer's quiver needed to be full, often with dozens of arrows, each one paid for, each one cared for, each one replaced when lost or damaged. If your lord supplied arrows before a campaign, you were expected to return what remained, or to pay for the missing ones. If you needed to buy more, you needed coin, and that coin came from your wages, from your work, from your careful savings. Your bracers, those pieces of leather worn on your forearm to protect your skin from the snap of the string, needed to be made, bought, and maintained. Your quiver, your small tools for repairing arrows and strings, your wax for maintaining your bowstring, your oil for protecting your bow from damp and cracking. Each small piece added to the quiet drain of your resources. Each reminder that your role as an archer was not simply about skill, but about your willingness to bear the cost of readiness. And if you could not afford these things, you risked being unprepared, unable to draw your bow properly, unable to shoot with accuracy, unable to serve in your lord's retinue when called. You risked losing your place, losing your wages, losing your value in the eyes of your community and your commanders. You risked dishonor or worse, leaving yourself defenseless in the chaos of battle, when your string snapped, when your arrows ran out, when your bow cracked in the cold. It was not uncommon to see archers at the market bartering for a handful of good arrows, trading labor for a new string, working additional days in the fields to save for a replacement bow after theirs had failed. Some men would take on work repairing arrows for others, crafting strings in the evenings by firelight, or helping fletch for those who could not pay the bowyer's full price, earning a small bit of coin or trade goods in return. Your investment was ongoing. Even after you bought your bow, your arrows, your bracers, your string, you needed to care for them constantly. You needed to oil your bow to protect it from damp, to inspect it for cracks, to store it properly so it did not warp. You needed to check your string before and after each practice or battle, to wax it, to tighten it. to replace it when frayed. You needed to gather your spent arrows after practice, clean them, repair them, straighten any bent shafts, replace broken fletchings, sharpen dull points. Each of these tasks took time you could have spent resting, working your fields, helping your family, or earning additional wages. But you did them because you had to, because an archer without equipment was no archer at all, because readiness was your responsibility, because your skill was only as good as the tools you maintained. There was a quiet pride in this, too. The way you learned to craft and repair. The way your hands knew the feel of a good arrow, the right tension of a string, the smooth curve of a well-kept bow. The way you became part craftsman, part soldier, part caretaker of your own readiness. The way you learned to value each piece of your equipment, to care for it as an extension of yourself. Yet the pride could not always cover the quiet unfairness of it. The reality that while the realm needed you, it did not always provide for you. The knight received his armor, his horse, his rations, his squire. You received your coins, small and hard-earned, and from that, you funded your own war. And so, when you stood on the battlefield, your bow in your hand, your arrows in your quiver, your string taut and ready, you carried not only the weight of your skill, but the weight of every coin you had spent to prepare for that moment. You stood with the quiet knowledge that each shot was valuable, each arrow a piece of your effort, each draw of the string a reminder of the sacrifices made to stand ready. You were an archer, and your readiness was your own burden to bear. On the battlefield, you learned quickly that pain was part of your trade, as familiar as the feel of your bow in your hand or the hiss of an arrow in flight. A twisted ankle from shifting on uneven ground, a cut from a stray blade, a bruised shoulder from the weight of your quiver, blisters on your fingers, burns and the string snapping back. All these were everyday realities. But there was another, harsher truth. If you were injured, there was little help waiting for you. Knights might receive the care of a surgeon or a learned physician, a monk with salves and herbs tending to their wounds, a place in a warm bed in a castle hall while they recovered. Their injuries were treated with urgency, their recovery overseen by squires and servants, their needs met as best that could be managed in a world where medical knowledge was limited. But you, as an archer, were a common soldier. You were essential on the field, but you were replaceable. Your wounds were your burden to bear, your pain your constant companion. Your recovery, if it came, a matter of your own endurance and luck rather than structured care. When you were injured on the field, if you were fortunate enough to survive, you might be carried away by your comrades, laid upon the cold earth at the edge of the battlefield as the clash of steel continued nearby. If your injury was minor, a cut, a graze from an arrow, a bruise, you would bind it yourself if you could, tearing a strip from your tunic, pressing against the wound, hoping to stop the bleeding before returning to your position, bow in hand, ready to shoot again. If your injury was more severe, a deep gash, a broken bone, an arrow lodged in your flesh, the options were far fewer. You might be helped from the field if your comrades could spare the time, and if the lines had not yet broken. You might be taken to a rough camp where women and elderly men tended the wounded as best they could, using rags and wine to clean wounds, binding them with strips of cloth, praying for the fever not to come. But there was no guarantee of this care, and there was no promise of skilled help. Often, the tools of healing were as rough as the tools of war. A dagger used to remove an arrow, a heated blade used to cauterize a wound, herbal poultices applied without understanding whether they would help or harm. Pain relief was rare, a gulp of strong wine, a piece of leather bite down upon, a prayer whispered through clenched teeth as the wound was cleaned or stitched. Infections were common, the wounds often becoming swollen and red, the skin hot to touch, the body trembling with fever. Many wounds that were survivable in the moment became fatal in the days that followed, the slow march of infection claiming the lives of men who had survived the chaos of the battlefield. You would see comrades who had fought bravely, who had stood beside you, who had loosed arrows with steady hands, now lying on blankets, their breath ragged, their eyes distant, waiting for death as the fever took them. And if you survived, if the wound healed, it was often with scars that limited your movement, with bones that did not set properly, leaving limbs crooked and stiff, with pain that will remain with you for the rest of your life. A cut on your hand could mean stiffness in your fingers, making it harder to draw your bow. A wound to your shoulder could mean your draw was weaker, your aim less steady. A broken rib could ache with every breath, reminding you daily of the cost of that moment on the field. There was no pension, no structured support to care for you if you could no longer fight. If your injury was severe enough to prevent you from drawing your bow, you could find yourself without income, unable to fulfill your role, forced to find other means to survive, often harder and lower paying than even the modest wages you earned as an archer. And so, you were cautious. You learned to protect yourself as best you could, to stay light on your feet, to watch the flow of battle, to avoid being caught in the crush of cavalry or the clash of infantry, to stay just far enough back while loosing your arrows to avoid the worst of the chaos, while remaining close enough to be effective. You learned to read the battlefield with your eyes and with your instincts, knowing that an injury could mean not just pain, but the end of your place, your purpose, your ability to provide for your family. Yet, there were moments when caution could not protect you. The arrow that struck without warning, the charge that came too quickly, the chaos that swallowed your position. In those moments, you could only hope that your wound would be survivable, that your comrades would help you, that the fever would not come, that your body would heal enough for you to return to your bow. You saw many who did not return. Friends who had stood beside you, who had shared laughter by the campfire, who had trained with you on the practice fields, who had fought with you in battles past. You saw them wounded, carried from the field, and you saw the quiet fear in their eyes as they realized that their future was now uncertain, that their strength had been taken from them, that their skill with the bow might no longer be enough. And you carried that fear within yourself, hidden behind the steady hands with which you loose your arrows, behind the calm focus of your aim, behind the routine of checking your bowstring, your arrows, your stance. Because you knew that a single moment could change everything, that the lack of medical support meant your survival often depended on your luck and your body's ability to heal on its own. In the evenings, when you returned home or to camp, you might tend to your own small wounds, cleaning them with wine if you could afford it, binding them with strips of linen, inspecting them for signs of infection, praying as you did so. You might stretch your back, rub your shoulders, massage your swollen fingers, trying to ease the pain before the next day's demands. This was your life as an archer. You were valuable, but you were expendable. You were skilled, but you were replaceable. You were injured, and you were expected to recover on your own, with little help, little care, and no certainty of return. And yet you continued, because you had no choice, because the bow was your craft, because the kingdom needed your arrows, even if it did not care for your wounds, because you were an archer, and you would rise each day, tend to your pain, draw your bow, and prepare for the next battle, knowing the risk, accepting the burden, because it was your duty. You spent your childhood training for bow, your youth perfecting your aim, your strength built from years of drawing heavy strings and loosing countless arrows into straw targets and later into the chaos of battle. Your calloused fingers and aching back, your swollen joints and twisted spine, all bore witness to your dedication, your place, your readiness. But on the battlefield, none of that guaranteed you a place of safety or respect. Because in war, you learn a quiet, sobering truth. You were valued for your utility, but you were disposable. The kingdom needed your arrows. Your lord needed your skill. Your volleys could decide the outcome of a charge, could break enemy formations, could kill knights before they reached the line. You were necessary, but you were not irreplaceable. For every skilled archer who fell, there were young boys waiting in the village fields, drawing lighter bows, eager to prove themselves, ready to take your place the moment you could no longer stand. Commanders praised the power of the archer corps, yet when the battle lines were drawn, you were often placed at the front or the flanks, the exposed positions where your arrows could do the most damage, but where the risk of injury of death was highest. You were the storm before the clash, the thin line that loosed arrow after arrow while the enemy advanced, trusting that your volleys would slow them, scatter them, weaken them before the melee began. But if the enemy cavalry broke through, if the infantry advanced faster than expected, if the battle turned, you were among the first to fall. The knights might be pulled back, the men-at-arms might form shield walls, but you, with your bow and light protection, often had no such shield, no such armor, no such retreat. If you were caught, your bow became useless, Your light dagger or hatchet a poor match for the armored knight's sword or the infantryman's spear. Your death was not marked with songs, nor were there ransom negotiations for your safe return if captured. Your family might receive a small sum if your lord was merciful, but more often, your death was simply noted, your name spoken quietly among your comrades, your place in line filled by another who could draw the bow and send arrows flying. Even in survival, you felt your disposability. If you were injured and could no longer draw your bow, you were of little use to your commander. There was no pension, no promise of care, no guarantee of continued support. You became another burden on your family. Your worth diminished the moment your skill was lost injury. You felt it in the pay you received, less than that of a knight, often less than that of a well-regarded man-at-arms. Your equipment, so vital to your role, was often self-funded, your readiness your responsibility alone. Your skill was praised when it served, but once your arrows were spent, once your arm could no longer draw, your presence was overlooked, your value measured in the number of volleys you could still provide, the number of arrows you could still loose. And yet, despite the knowledge of your disposability, you continued. You continued because the bow was your craft, the only path given to you in a world where choices were few, where your family's safety and your own survival depended on your ability to contribute. You continued because your skill mattered, because on the battlefield, your arrows were the first line of resistance, because your craft could save lives, could hold the line, could weaken the enemy before the clash of steel. You found pride in your accuracy, in the discipline you had built, in the quiet strength it took to stand your ground, to draw, aim, and release under the fear of advancing cavalry and falling arrows. You found pride in knowing that while you might be seen as replaceable, your skill could not easily be matched, that each shot you took mattered, that each arrow you loosed could shift the outcome of a moment. You saw the young men who came to take your place, eager, untested, their eyes bright with the promise of glory. You watched them as they learned the truth of the bow, as they felt the sting of the string on their forearms, the ache in their shoulders, the shaking in their hands after a day of practice. You saw them on the battlefield, saw the fear in their eyes as the enemy advanced, saw the moment they realized that the stories of glory did not match the mud, the blood, the terror of war. And you felt a quiet sorrow, knowing they too would learn what you had learned, that their worth was tied to their utility, that their service was valued only while they could still draw, aim, and release, that their place in the world was built upon a skill that could be replaced when their body failed. But you also felt a quiet pride, knowing that you had stood your ground, that you had done your part, that you had served with skill and dedication, even in a world that saw you as disposable. You knew that your arrows had mattered, that your craft had made a difference, that your service had been given fully, even if it was not always honored fully in return. And so, each day you continued. You rose with the dawn, checked your bow, counted your arrows, tested your string. You stretched your aching shoulders, flexed your swollen fingers, felt the stiffness in your back, and prepared yourself to train, to stand ready, to serve once more. Because you were an archer, because this was your duty, because even in a world that saw you as replaceable, you knew your worth in the steady draw of the string, in the quiet focus of your aim, in the whisper of the arrow leaving your bow. And you would continue, as long as your strength allowed, to stand your ground, to hold your place, to send your arrows into the world, because this was the life you had chosen, and the life that had chosen you. Chapter 6, The Psychological Toll. When you first learned to draw the bow, to feel the tension in the string, to steady your breath as you aimed, you learned that your power came from distance. The bow was a weapon of reach, allow you to strike an enemy who could not yet strike you, allow your arrows to darken the sky and fall upon soldiers, horses, and knights before they could close the gap and bring the clash of steel. And in that distance, you might have believed you were safe, not just from the swords and lances of your foes, but from the weight of what it meant to take a life. Because the truth was, it was easier to let the arrow fly than to stand face to face with the man who would fall. You did not see his eyes in the final moment, did not hear his last breath from inches away, did not feel the tremble of his hand against yours as he slipped away. From the field, you saw only the shapes in armor, the advancing line, the cavalry charge, the enemy archers on a rise across from you. You saw targets and you aimed and you released again and again, But the bow did not absolve you of what it meant to kill. You saw the arrows fall, saw the men tumble, saw the horses rear and collapse as your volleys found their mark. You saw the line break as your arrows struck, heard the cries of the wounded as they fell, heard the screams of men trying to crawl to safety, heard the moans of those who would not rise again. Even from a distance, the sounds of war reached you, the sights of death reached you, the knowledge of what your arrows had done reached you, and it stayed with you. You would remember the battles, not just for the mud and the chaos, not just for fear and the exhaustion, but for the moments when you saw the results of your skill. You would remember the man clutching at the arrow that had pierced his chest, the way his knees buckled as he fell. You would remember the horse that screamed as it went down, the knight trapped beneath it, unable to rise. You would remember the faces of the wounded, the fear, the pain, the realization in their eyes as they looked down and saw your arrow, the thin shaft that had changed everything in an instant. You had trained for this. You had been told it was necessary, that your arrows protected your comrades, that they weakened the enemy, that they turned the tide of battle, that they saved lives on your side by ending them on the other. And all of this was true, but the truth did not silence the memory. At night, when the fires burned low and the world grew quiet, when the noise of day faded, you would see their faces in your mind. You would remember the way your fingers had released the string, the way the arrow had flown, the way it had found its mark. You would remember that you were the one who had sent it, that the death you saw was the death you had caused, even if you had never meant to see that particular man, that particular face, fall, because the bow allowed you to kill from a distance. But it did not separate you from the reality of killing. You learned to live with it because you had to. You told yourself that it was necessary, that it was your duty, that it was the way of war. You reminded yourself that your arrows protected your family, your village, your fellow soldiers, that without your skill, the enemy would overrun your lines, that others would die if you did not do your part. And these things were true, but there were days when the weight of it was heavy, when you woke in the morning with the memory of the faces you had seen, with the sound of the wounded in your ears, with the knowledge that your skill, your craft, your purpose was tied to death. You saw young archers learning to shoot, laughing as they hit their targets, proud of their growing skill, eager to stand on the field and prove themselves. And you remembered when you were like them, when the bow was only a tool, when the arrow was only a feathered stick, when the target was just a straw circle in the field. You knew they, too, would learn the truth, that the moment would come when the arrow found its mark in flesh rather than straw, when the pride of a clean shot would be replaced by the reality of what that shot meant, when the distance would no longer be enough to protect them from the knowledge of what they had done. Some men turned hard, letting the necessity of war close their hearts, telling themselves it was nothing, that the enemy deserved it, that this was the way of things. Others carried it quietly, feeling the weight of each life ended, seeing the faces in dreams, remembering the moments when they released the string, knowing it was necessary, but never forgetting the cost. You learned to keep your hand steady, your aim true, your breath calm. You learned to do your duty, to draw, aim, and release, to send your arrows into the advancing line, to watch them fall, to knock the next arrow and do it again. You learned to live with the knowledge that you killed from a distance, that your arrows were your reach, your power, your promise, your burden, because you were an archer, because the kingdom needed your arrows, because this was your craft, and you carried it, the quiet weight of what it meant to take a life from afar. Each time you drew your bow, each time you let the arrow fly, each time you watched the field beyond the distance, because this was the life you had chosen, and the life that had chosen you. They never told you, when you first picked up the bow, how loud the battlefield could be. They told you the power of the longbow, of the pride of standing with your fellow archers in line, of the rain of arrows that could turn the tide of a battle before the swords ever clashed. They told you how your arrows would keep the knights at bay, would weaken the enemy before they reached the lines, would protect your friends and your home. But they did not tell you about the screams. They did not tell you how the cries of the wounded would haunt the spaces between each breath, how you would hear them even after the battle ended, in the dark hours before dawn, in the moments when the world was quiet and your mind could not keep the sounds away. On the practice field, your arrow struck straw targets with a comforting thump. You learned to judge the wind, the distance, the arc of the arrow as it flew. You learned to adjust your aim for a moving target, to knock your next arrow without looking, to draw and release in a single smooth motion. You learned the rhythm of the bow, the discipline of the shot. But on the battlefield, your arrows found flesh instead of straw, and flesh screams when it is pierced. Your first battle was a blur of fear and noise. The command came, and you raised your bow, drew, aimed, released. You saw the arrow fly, saw it join the dark cloud of others, saw it fall into the advancing ranks of the enemy. Then you reached for your next arrow, knocked, drew, released again and again, your arms burning, your breath coming fast, the world narrowing to the rhythm of draw, aim, release. At first, you did not hear the screams, not over the clash of steel, the thunder of hooves, the shouted commands. But as the battle slowed, as the lines pressed and bent, as the chaos found its rhythm, you began to hear them. The cry of a man struck in the leg, falling to the ground, clutching at the shaft of the arrow embedded in his thigh, the scream tearing from his throat as he tried to crawl away, the moan of another, pierced in the stomach, his hands pressing against the wound, blood leaking between his fingers as he begged for help, the whinnying shriek of a horse as it went down, the night pinned beneath it, calling out as he struggled to move, trapped and helpless. You saw these things, but worse, you heard them. And you knew, in the quiet space between one arrow loosed and the next knocked, that some of those screams were because of you. You had done your duty. You had aimed true. You had served as you were meant to serve, sending your arrows into the enemy to protect your lines, to weaken the charge, to hold the field. But the screams reminded you that your skill with the bow was not clean, that the distance did not protect you from reality of what you had done. Some men learned to ignore the screams, to push them aside, to focus on the next arrow, the next target, the next moment of survival. Some turned hard, laughing as they loosed their shots, boasting of the men they had felled, convincing themselves that the screams meant nothing, that the enemy was the enemy and nothing more. But many could not ignore them, not truly. They carried those screams with them, back to camp, back to the village, back to their homes when the battle was over. They heard them in the quiet moments, when the fire burned low, when the night was still, when the mind could no longer be distracted by the tasks of survival. The screams would come back, reminders of the cost of each arrow, of the weight of the skill you had spent your life perfecting. You tried to justify it. You reminded yourself that this was war, that your arrows protected your comrades, that without your skill, the enemy would have advanced, would have killed your friends, would have burned your home, would have taken everything. You told yourself that it was necessary, that you were serving your Lord, your kingdom, your family. And these things were true, but they did not silence the screams. You found ways to cope, small rituals that allowed you to carry on. You would care for your bow with precision, wiping it clean, checking the string, inspecting each arrow, letting the focus on these tasks quiet your mind. You would help your comrades, sharing your rations, checking on the younger archers, reminding yourself that your skill protected them, that your arrows gave them a chance to return home alive. You would pray, if you believed, for forgiveness, for peace, for the strength to continue. You would sit by the fire at night, staring into the flames, letting the crackle of the wood drown out the echoes in your mind. You would rise each morning, stretch your aching shoulders, flex your swollen fingers, pick up your bow, and continue, because this was your duty, because you could not turn away, because this was a life you had chosen. And over time, the screams became a part of you, like the ache in your back, the stiffness in your neck, the calluses on your fingers. They did not leave, but you learned to live with them, to carry them as you carried your bow, to accept that they were part of the price you paid for your skill, for your duty, for your place in the world. Because you were an archer, because your arrows mattered, because your craft saved lives, even as it ended others, because this was your life, and you carried it every day with steady hands and a quiet heart, loosing your arrows into the world, knowing the truth of what it meant to serve, knowing the weight of each shot, knowing the sound of the battlefield, the screams of the wounded, the echo that never fully left you. From the moment you first picked up the bow as a child, it became a part of you. The weight of the stave, the tension of the string, the feel of the arrow resting against your fingers, the rhythm of breath and release. These were the skills that defined your days, the path laid out for you by your family, your village, your lord, your kingdom. You trained because you had to, because the law demanded it, because your community relied on it, because the world you lived in required men who could stand with bow in hand when danger came. And when you grew strong enough, when your aim was steady, when your skill was sharpened through years of practice, you went to war and you served. You did your duty. You protected your comrades. You held the line. You stood in the mud and the rain, loosing arrows into the advancing enemy, trusting that your skill would keep the chaos at bay, that your craft would preserve the lives of those you fought beside. But when the battle ended and the field fell silent, the arrows spent, the dead and dying left behind in the churned earth, you were left with a quiet that came after clash. And in that quiet, something else began to speak within you. Because the church taught that life was sacred, that the taking of life was a grave sin, that every soul was weighed, that every action would one day be accounted for before God. The priest spoke of heaven and hell, of purgatory and eternal judgment, of the stain of sin that could cling to the soul if not confessed, if not absolved. And you, the archer, who had spent your life sending arrows into men you had never met, began to wonder what your soul carried. At first, you told yourself that it was different in war. The priests who blessed the army before battle spoke of righteous causes, of God's will, of the need to protect the kingdom, the faith, the people. They told you that your service was holy, that your arrows flew with the approval of heaven when loose in defense of your home and your Lord. And you believed them until the quiet moments came. You began to remember the faces of the men who fell, the sound of their cries, the way they clutched at your arrows as they died. You began to see them in your dreams, faceless sometimes, but with eyes that looked directly into yours, as if they saw you across the battlefield, as if they knew it would loose the arrow that ended their breath. You wondered if they were sinners or if they were men like you, farmers taken from their fields, fathers, brothers, sons pressed into service by their own lords, fighting for reasons they did not choose, dying because they stood on the wrong side of a line drawn by men more powerful than either of you would ever be. You wondered if God saw the difference. In the church, you knelt with your head bowed, whispering prayers for forgiveness, clutching the rosary, trying to ease the weight in your chest. You listened to the priest speak of confession and penance, of sins forgiven, of the mercy of God. You hoped that your prayers were enough, that your service was understood, that the arrows you loosed were counted as duty rather than murder. But you could not be sure, because sometimes in the depth of night, when the world was quiet, you felt the guilt pressing down upon you, a weight that settled into your bones, into the calloused tips of your fingers, into the stiffness of your shoulders. You remember the sermons about sin, about judgment, about the fires of hell that awaited the unrepentant. You remembered that each man you struck down had a soul, a family, a life. You questioned whether God would forgive the taking of those lives, even in war, even in service, even in duty. Some men tried to bury the guilt, turning themselves hard, telling themselves that the enemy deserved death, that God would sort the souls, that they were only tools in the hands of their lords. Some turned to drink to silence the thoughts that came in the darkness. Some sought out the priests, begging for absolution, offering coins for prayers, lighting candles in the hope that the light would ease the shadows in their hearts. You found your own ways to carry it. You continued to train, to serve, to fulfill your role, reminding yourself of the reasons, of the necessity, of the duty that demanded your skill. You told yourself that without your arrows, more would die, that you saved lives on your side, even as you ended lives on the other. But you also prayed. Each morning before you strung your bow, you whispered prayers beneath your breath, asking for forgiveness, for mercy, for protection against the weight that pressed upon your soul. Each evening, as you cleaned your bow and checked your arrows, you whispered again, seeking peace, seeking understanding, seeking a sign that your service was not a stain upon your spirit. You gave alms when you could, helping the poor, aiding the church, trying to balance the weight you carried with small acts of kindness, hoping they would count for something in the final measure. You listened carefully during Mass, letting the chants and prayers wash over you, hoping they would cleanse the quiet guilt that lived within you, because you were an archer, because you had done your duty, because you had killed from a distance, and you could not change that. And so, you lived with the tension between the skill you had spent your life mastering and the fear that the skill itself had marked you, You live with the hope that God would understand, that the prayers you whisper would be heard, that the mercy spoken by the priest would extend even to you. You continue to rise each day, to stand in the line, to draw, aim and release, to send your arrows into the world, because you had to, because you were needed, because there was no other path. But you carried the guilt with you, tucked quietly behind the calm of your focus, behind the discipline of your craft, behind the steady breath that guided your aim, because you were an archer, and you knew what it meant to kill, and you feared what that might mean for your soul. The battle would end. Eventually, the clash of sword would quiet. The cries of the wounded would fade. The smoke would drift away on the cold morning breeze. The banners would lower. The captains would call the roll. The dead would be counted. The living would be gathered, and you would begin the long walk home. But what they never told you about the life of an archer was that the war did not leave you when you left the field. It followed you home, settling into the spaces between your breaths, into the quiet moments when the world was still, into places where others could not see, could not feel, could not understand. Because while the kingdom might celebrate the victory, while the villagers might gather to welcome home the men who had fought, while your family might hold you tightly, relieved to see you alive, there was a distance that came with you, a silence that grew around you, a separation between you and the world you returned to. You stood in the mud and blood, loosing arrows into men who fell, hearing their screams, seeing the fear in their eyes even from a distance, carrying the weight of each shot. Each life ended, each moment when your skill had made the difference between survival and death. And while the others might be grateful, might thank you, might praise your skill, they could not know what it felt like. They could not know how the memory of the field would come back to you in the night, how the dreams would return, how the sound of your arrows finding their mark would echo in your mind, how the cries of the wounded would slip into the quiet moments of your day, unbidden, unwanted, unending. You might sit by the fire, your family around you, the children laughing, the food warm in your hands, and feel the heaviness in your chest, the hollow ache that came from knowing what you had done to stand there, to be there, to protect them. You might watch the world go on around you, the markets bustling, the fields busy with the work of planting and harvest, and feel a step removed, as if you stood behind a thin veil that separated you from the life you had once known. Because you were an archer, and you had seen what the arrows did. Some people would look at you with respect, grateful for your service, nodding as you passed, offering you a place at the table, a mug of ale, a piece of bread. But sometimes you would see the fear, too, the way the eyes of your neighbors flickered as they looked at the bow slung across your back, at the scars on your hands, at the way your shoulders hunched slightly from the years of drawing the string, at the way you watched the horizon, always measuring the distance, always judging the wind. They did not understand that the bow was not just a weapon you carried, but a part of who you had become, that your life was measured in arrows loosed and battle survived, that your worth had been proven in the mud and the rain, in the silence between shots, in the discipline of your aim. They did not understand the price you had paid for your skill, the weight you carried each day, the fear that sometimes crept in at night when the wind howled and you remembered the screams. You tried to return to the rhythms of the village, to the tasks you had known before the war, to the work of the fields, to the mending of tools, to the tending of animals. You tried to laugh with the others, to join the songs by the fire, to hold your children without the shadow in your eyes. You tried to be who you had been before. But the isolation came quietly, not because you wanted it, but because it grew from the distance between what others could see and what you could never forget. Some men found solace in drink, letting the ale or the wine blur the memories, quiet the mind, soften the edges of the guilt and fear that clung to them. Others returned to the bow, to practice field, to the rhythm of draw, aim, release, finding comfort in the familiarity, in the discipline, in the skill that had once made them valuable, even if it set them further apart from the life around them. Some simply grew quiet, withdrawing into themselves, speaking less, watching more, carrying the weight in silence, letting the world move around them while they remained still, holding the memories close, letting them settle into the bones until they became another part of who they were. You saw the young men who returned from their first battle, their eyes wide and distant, their laughter quieter, their movements slower. You recognized the signs because you had seen them in yourself, because you knew what they were learning, what they were carrying, what they would never be able to set down. And you wish you could ease it for them. Wish you could take the weight away. Wish you could silence the memories that would come from in the night. But you knew that you could not, that this was the price of the bow, the price of war, the price of serving as an archer in a world that needed your arrows but did not understand the burden they placed upon you. So you learned to live with the isolation, to find small moments of peace in the work of your hands, in the laughter of your children, in the warmth of the fire. You learned to accept that the distance was part of your life now, that the quiet you carried was your own, that the world would go on, and you would move within it, a step removed, a breath apart, because you were an archer, because you had done your duty, because the kingdom had needed you and you had answered, and now you live with the silence that came after, the isolation that followed you home, the quiet that settled into your bones, reminding you each day of who you were, of what you had done, of what you carried, because this was your life, and you accepted it because there was no other way. Conclusion: when we think of medieval archers, we often picture the rain of arrows darkening the sky, the quiet strength of men standing firm, the skill and discipline in every shot. And all of that is true, but behind the pride of the bow lay calloused fingers, twisted shoulders, and the quiet weight of memories carried home from muddy fields. Behind every arrow loose was a man who paid for that skill with years of practice, with the aches that never left, with the sound of the wounded in his dreams, with the guilt and fear of what each arrow truly meant. The life of a medieval archer was not a tale of glory alone. It was early mornings in cold practice fields, the burden of self-funded readiness, the pain of seeing your worth measured in coins, the loneliness of returning to a world that did not fully understand the quiet distance you brought back with you. It was a knowledge that each arrow carried weight, that each life taken left a mark, that the skill you had spent your life perfecting came at a cost. Yet still, the archer stood, bow in hand, steady, calm, ready, because this was his craft, his duty, his place in the world. And in the soft quiet after the battle, in the hush before dawn, he carried it all, arrow by arrow, breath by breath. Once again, if you like this video, don't forget to like and subscribe, so we have more motivation to produce better quality products. And now, good night.